What is up, you savages? This is the Protect Your Neck podcast, and I'm your host, Dan Tom. Analysis work you could find over at MMAJunkie.com, but on this here program, the Protect Your Neck podcast, we break down high-level MMA, but we do it in a slightly different way, especially on these top 5 shows. We don't like to timestamp them too much, but we are in the year of 2020, worldwide COVID-19 epidemic, so we're going to be leaning more on a bit of a historical retrospective, some fun fights, some stuff that hopefully you can leave this episode and have plenty of things to watch. To do that, of course, I always need a guest co-host, and it's always fun when I have a first-time guest co-host, but really a long-time one that I've wanted to get on. Of course, he's a co-host on his own podcast. It is Brad Taschuk, who you can find on Twitter at Brazchuck, of course, from the MMA Analysis podcast, a podcast I always tip my hat to the OGs over there. Thank you for joining, Brad.
Thank you for having me, man. I always appreciate the shout outs that you give to myself and the MMA Analysis guys. We have a little bit of a different take on MMA from the professionals such as yourself who take this seriously and put in the work. We just sort of like to have a couple drinks and chat and see where the podcast takes us. So it's going to be a little different adventure for me, but I know that you can get off the rails a little bit. So I'm sure we'll go there today.
Yeah, for better or worse, mostly worse, as most of my listeners know, I'm very honest, and my sense of humor, as you kind of hinted at your show, well, it's not exactly a highbrow, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, I say it in just a very self-honest, self-deprecating way. I'm a 9-year-old at heart, so dick jokes make me laugh. So kind of what Brad was alluding to, their podcast is like labeled as betting and MMA breakdowns, but like if we had a pie chart for like the betting, the MMA talk, and the talk about men's genitalia and hogs, like I would love to see that pie chart. I really would,
We'll work something in for you. I'll make sure I'll have to timestamp the next episode and see where we go, especially right now because we're doing some rewatches of old events and stuff like that. So kind of going down the same road that you're going here. And man, it makes for some good listening and some good watching.
Dude, as we get the plugs out of the way and we push on to the show, of course, we're going to be doing top 5 WEC fights if you haven't read the title or if you're just listening and joining us now. I do want to say, though, you guys recently covered a WEC fight in your watchbacks. And by the way, if you're not subscribing, whether it's on YouTube or iTunes, the MMA Analysis, great podcast. You guys are picking great cards. But you guys recently did a WEC card as we steer it back into the topic of this show, right?
We did. We were between a few of them. We had a few. They entrusted me to make the decision, and we decided to go with WEC 35, which is an event people talk about a lot, although I think we might end up talking about at least one of the fights during our podcast today, not to spoil the list too much. But this is a forgotten card, partly because it gets into that welterweight, light heavyweight sort of range of the WEC, which is forgotten as well. But it is absolutely phenomenal in terms of the action that you see on that card. And it really just is an exemplary example of the WEC.
Yeah, for example, this isn't tipping my hat on anything, but one of the many notes I have on my page here in front of me, Brad, it says WEC 35, great card. There are 2 cards additionally, which I'll be giving out at some point in the episode, and I'll recap and remind you at the end here. But as far as like top to bottom great cards, which is really hard to do with these WEC cards because you're really hard pressed not to find a bad card, but like bad fights. So hopefully, I'm sure you have some favorites that you'll really strongly recommend to listeners, Brad, and I'll definitely list those off sometime through this episode.
Absolutely. I think we'll get into those as we start to go through our different lists, because I could name a bunch of stuff off of any WEC card off the top of my head, but I think we'll get a little bit more specific as we go.
Absolutely. And listeners of the show already know the rules. I will do my quick recap into it as we roll into it briefly here. But I also kind of want to start this episode with a little bit of just kind of some historical I don't know what you call it, just setting up the scene, so to speak, Brad, because this is a really fun topic, man. Some topics are I don't want to say are more fun than others because I'll be surprised on this show. I'll be like, I don't know about this topic, or it's a different topic with a different host. We end up having a kick-ass show, so I'm not talking about that so much, but like this is the kind of topic, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, Brad. Like it deserves its respect, it deserves its due. You know what I'm saying?
there's so much to the WEC, and people think WEC, they think the final few events, they think bantamweight, featherweight, lightweight, and that's it. But there were multiple iterations of the WEC, and they were all entertaining in their own way. They were all great, and they served a really important purpose for MMA as a whole.
Absolutely. To your point, if you're playing the Kevin Bacon 7 Degrees of Separation game with MMA, like plenty of the your favorites, as far as if you're smart and you know which fighters to link to, a lot of them will cross paths in the WEC. Like, so in other words, if you do your WEC homework, you will kick ass at that 7 Degrees of Separation MMA game. You know what I'm talking about, Brad?
Absolutely, yeah.
So for people that don't know, the WEC is founded by Scott Adams, who's their matchmaker up till a certain point in time, and Reed Harris, if you talk to him, he's a really genuine guy. I almost compare him to a Scott Coker. The praise that Scott Coker gets with a lot of these guys as far as appreciating the martial artists and really making sure, like Reed Harris, he was just like, you could see him in the background going in to shake hands doing the Joe Silva bit, but he was also checking to see if guys were okay. And he had a real strong respect. They start the WEC essentially in 2001. Their first card is called Princes of Pain, which, Brad, chime in here. It's very classic MMA in the sense of, like, whether we're talking commentary or the way it's just talked about or titled in general. It runs the fine line between mixed martial arts and gay BDSM, right? You don't know what you're getting with these titles.
Yes, and this was definitely, turn of the millennium when cards were named, and it was all about the name. You've got your sudden impacts and your worlds collide and onslaughts in the UFC. And as you get further away from the UFC, the names get a little bit more and more ridiculous. And WC definitely started off on the right page.
Oh, they have one that's like, what are they, like 5 in, and they're already using "this time it's personal." Yeah. It's great. But that card, the Princes of Pain, it's headlined by Dan Severn and Travis Fulton. Again, your 7 Degrees of Separation game. Travis Fulton's a great one, folks. Just to kind of give you a timestamp. But you know what I was surprised by? There's some names on there that hardcores may know. But Leonard Garcia is down there, scrapping at 22 years old. I didn't realize he was born in 79. I thought he was younger for some reason. But yeah, Leonard Garcia officially on the first WEC card for trivia there, folks.
Yeah, that one, I was looking up the cards. I didn't actually watch this card because it's one of the difficult ones to find. It's not on Fight Pass. But I don't think there's anything that we're missing by not having watched that card, unless you were able to get one of those, California tapes back in the day during the exchanges. But it's definitely got some historical value, that's for sure.
Yeah, and not to spoil, but like the old fights, the really old ones aren't going to be on my list, so I'm not stepping on anything here. But like, if you do go back and watch some of them, it really just casts like it's a different light. It's like you've got this like Penn and Teller looking like commentator dude. Like it's creepy.
He was great on some of the Halloween events.
Oh yeah,
so you dressed up, and I was watching some of these, and I think you got into MMA around the same time as me, sort of that like mid-aughts period.
Yes.
Maybe not directly with Tough, but yes, like right around that area. And I remember I was watching some of these cards back, and there's an ad on the ring card girl's ass for a bar called Bogart and Lulu's, which was this like notorious bar in Visalia, where there was like 3 murders and like 17 stabbings and all sorts of shit. And I was watching these cards and I was like, I know that name. Why do I know that name? So I went and looked it up and went down that weird rabbit hole. But these are the places the WC takes you.
Oh, totally. I mean, you want to talk about from like the places being advertised, the fighters, which is a given, to like the referees. And I'm not hating on Josh Rosenthal, by the way, but like there are crime side stories for for so many people. There's so many crime side stories and side streets and offshoots, right? Like we can reference here.
Yes, and you've got our favorite accomplice to murder, John Shorley.
Oh my God, yes. John Shorley, like there was a name that popped up, like I think Justin Levin, and I'm like, I remember when Justin Levin was like one of the only like fighters who died. You know what I'm saying? Like now, like I feel like when I was doing like some top 5 lists for Junkie for work, and I'm like, oh, this fight does not age as well because this guy is now dead. And there's like more and more of those as we go on now. It feels like
it's turning into like pro wrestling at this point.
Oh, dude, and a lot of them are your brothers from the north. But anyways, on that positive note, essentially the organization pushes on, and they have a pentagon, by the way, folks. They actually have a pentagon in the earlier fights if you go and look. But when Zuffa LLC buys them in 2006, they change it to a smaller version. It's almost like a variation of the smaller octagon, which sadly we see less these days. Again, not to timestamp the show, but we're in 2020 now. But when they take over, Sean Shelby gets instituted. They initially retained Scott Adams, but Sean Shelby, which you can kind of see coming, gets instituted as the head matchmaker over there again in 2006. And they made a couple small changes. But yeah, in the WEC, of course, if you look at the overall too, especially the early days, like Brad was saying, it wasn't just lighter weight classes. Like the early days, essentially, you see a bunch of people from Tough One.
Yes, you do.
You know, you see a lot of weight classes, although they do have heavyweight fights. Correct me if I'm wrong here. I got the WECs marked down as far as when their vacant titles were debuted. Is this a hot trivia item, Brad? That they never actually had a heavyweight title?
They didn't, but I believe they had a super heavyweight title, didn't they?
That would have to be in the early ones because I think it was a tournament title. Because if you go to their earlier fights, you'll see like tournament brackets with guys like Brandon Vera on there. You know, getting his early knockouts and stuff and wiping house. So I think that's what they offered as far as heavyweights. But like, it was funny because later on, and again, this isn't spoiling anything, but like you'll see Mark Munoz making his debut, who was a UFC middleweight. I think he even got a knockout at light heavyweight, but he fights at heavyweight at the WEC, if I'm not mistaken, again's a Czech Congo looking dude. But again, there was no
that Chuck
like
Grigsby?
Yeah, exactly. Great call. But there's no I think he broke his hand trying to deliver that like really like gorilla like ground and pound where Munoz really got that
he got the mat.
Yeah.
He knocked him out like 3 punches later, but he broke his hand on the mat first.
That was brutal.
I remember that one.
I think that was a pretty brutal card too, from what I remember. As far as there was a lot of finishes, which again not uncommon when you go back and look at these WEC cards, folks.
Absolutely.
And anyways, WEC essentially it supplies a lot of like the tough seasons, particularly tough 1 to like tough 5 lightweights. You'll see a lot of that in the early WEC. Before again you start getting guys like we don't get Uriah Faber I think even till when the hell is it? Uriah Faber debuts at
19, I think.
Yep, 19. Nate Diaz debuts at 12. You don't get Carlos Condit or Dominic Cruz to WEC 26. You get Swanson and Brian Stan on that same show, by the way. Miguel Torres, which surprised me, he doesn't debut till WEC 30. I don't know why I remembered it differently in my head.
It just seemed like at that point in his career, he already had so many fights that even if you hadn't necessarily seen him on TV, you had probably heard about him. He was a little bit of a fixture, and obviously he went on to a pretty stellar run for a while there in WEC. So he's one of those guys that it feels like he was there for a lot longer than he was.
Sure thing. Well, now we're practically into the fight, so now let's get into the top 5 portion since we laid this part out of the show. Essentially, we go from 5-1, passing the basketball back and forth. Me and Brad were kind of talking pre-show, and we think there's definitely going to be some crossover, which is fine. There's no rules. The lunatics run the asylum here. We will double dive into them if that happens. Fear not, and we will get to yours and our honorable mentions at the very end as we get out of here. So strap in, folks. This should be a fun one. You ready, Brad?
I'm absolutely ready.
All right, cheers, man, and cheers to anybody watching who's partaking.
They should be.
Well, according to the social media story, like this dude was going to everyone's dumpsters and it was just all empty alcohol bottles everywhere, and it was great. He's like ratting everybody out. He goes, look at your nice little family. Oh, full of wine, empty wine bottles in the trash. And he was just
hey,
like,
it's
dunking
good for
on
those
people.
guys. Do you have those dudes that go around on like a Tuesday night or whatever your recycling night is, and they go through and they pick out the bottles? It's a great time for them. Like, not good for anybody else right now, but hey.
It is. We don't have an HOA, but 3 letters that if people are scratching that HOA, we'll get back to 3 letters you are familiar with. That is WEC fights, don't worry. Dan Tom gets off track, but not too much today. Brad, I'm going to
target.
Stay on target. That's right. That is me with everything. All right, you take the ball from ADD Dan over here, and Brad, what is your number 5 as far as top 5 WEC fights? Your top 5 again, folks. The lists are subjective.
All right, so I know Dan Tom. I know that when you come on Dan Tom's show, you gotta have a hipster pick. So I am going full hipster on this first pick, and my first fight. I was almost gonna try and argue for a tie here, but no other fight from this guy quite measures up to, and I know you said you're not going with anything old school, This is super old school. WEC 9, Olaf Alfonso, John Polakowski.
Yes.
This fight is absolute carnage. Every Olaf fight was pretty much carnage, but this one, it holds a special place in my heart. To set the table for it, because I'm sure there's some people out here that haven't seen this fight. John Polakowski accepted this fight, I think, as the story goes, at noon the day of the fight. This was a guy who was a Muay Thai fighter. He had never fought in MMA before, and he's like, yeah, I'll step in there and fight. And Olaf Alfonso is an absolute crazy man. So if you're picturing Olaf, you've got the wild man hair, and then you take, if like Rich Franklin and Andrei Arlovsky's nose is fucked, that's Olaf's nose. So this dude, I think in the post-fight interview for this fight, he actually says, like, the announcer at the time, I forget who it was. It might have been might have been Ron Kruk if they were on HDNet, or it might have been Ryan Bennett, rest in peace.
Yep.
He was like, your nose is going like 3 different directions right now, man. How many times have you broken it? And he's like, 9 times. He's like, does this make 10? He's like, no, I didn't break it this fight. But he's just bleeding from everywhere. I started to take some play-by-play for this fight, just for the people that haven't seen it. And this isn't going to make for the best radio, but I wrote down the first round, because the first round is just absolutely bonkers. The whole fight is, but there's some breaks in it where they stop to check cuts and things like that, which probably in the long run helps the pace of the fight stay as absurd as it is the whole way through. But the first round is just right through. Olaf, he comes out swinging. He lands a couple punches, backs Polakowski off to the bench. Polakowski drops him. Olaf goes like full on Nestea plunge, just like straight back onto the canvas. And then just scrambles up, lands a massive suplex. These guys start scrambling. Polakowski actually punches him like 8 times in the back of the head, and Rosenthal's reffing this fight. He does not care at all. He's just out there for blood just as much as these other guys. And then they start getting into, like, there's some weird grappling exchanges in this too for a guy that's never fought in MMA before. Like, Olaf gets a standing arm triangle at one point and uses it to get mount. So it's not a good fight by conventional fight standards, but it's just a fight. It is an absolute battle, and these guys go to war. And I had to like pause it a few times to catch up and try and get my play-by-play keep going. But I lost track after the first round, and this is something that if you've never seen it, you have to go back and watch this fight, because it's just nuts.
I second that, because I went back to watch this fight, and I'm going to have to go back and watch it again, because I also lost track after the first round for different reasons. I'm glad we mentioned Olaf Alonso, who is not on my list, but he's a guy I wanted to make sure we mention anyways. If you go back and you'll see him pop up a lot, but he's what I like to call like a plug-and-play action fighter, and you can see why he got booked a lot, win or lose, and repeatedly. Yep. Like, you could tell, I would love to see both the conversations Olaf had with the matchmakers. And he's credited as obviously being Mexican from Mexico. I'm not sure if he eventually camped up in California or what, but I would also love to see like his drives back and forth, like, because he was fighting so much at a certain point. Like, I wonder if the what do you call the border guard started recognizing him at a certain point. Like, oh, this is where the guy comes back and his nose gets fucked up again, and he comes back with a rearranged nose, because he was a plug and play action fighter. And this one, I'll be honest, it's not even on my honorable mentions list. But I was watching it late with the volume down, so I couldn't tell you who was commentating. Though I do know Bennett did do right around that era. And I also had a couple whiskeys, and I had a volume down. Didn't want to wake up the lady next to me, right? So I'm watching it quiet. I think I passed out about this fight, but it was a stupid action fight. Like the first round, it's definitely it's worth to go back and watch, and you can kind of see why this guy would be kind of like that undercard darling, like kind of like to put like a more modern day comparison, like almost like a Joe Lozon, in a sense, like he's going to be a guy you put either on the main card or the undercard, and he's going to do his job either way. He might, he's not necessarily going to be a title challenger or anything like that, but he's going to do his job.
Yeah, and I think Olaf might have even got to the point where
He did get a title shot, I
maybe
think.
he,
Like McCullough, right? Or
yeah,
something
he
like
got a
that.
title shot. No, although that fight was the one that I was thinking about pairing this one with for a tie for fifth, because
Yes.
it's actually like a really good fight. Like Olaf has McCullough in some trouble in the first
Yes.
round, and we mentioned John Shorley a few minutes ago. This is the infamous knockout where McCullough sends his mouthpiece across the cage. John Shorley's like, "Oh, better go fetch this mouthpiece," and then McCullough just flatlines him while he's on the ground, and Shorley takes forever to dawdle back with the mouthpiece. So McCullough lands like 2 or 3 more shots on the ground. It's just laser guided punches. Whew.
By the way, we all love fighters and are grateful for them and the entertainment and all that. We're not by any means demeaning that. And nor do I want to unfairly play into the stereotype that MMA seems like it's been spending its lifetime trying to shed. However, you can't deny that there are shady people involved with MMA, and whether it's a name you mentioned or perhaps we've already mentioned some names already. Like, one thing I noticed, Brad, you can chime in on this, like, there's a lot of, especially if you follow the hardcore storylines and you know offshoots, there's a lot of legal troubles and legal side stories with a lot of characters from sponsors, refs, to fighters in the WEC, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. What was I? I think I was watching one of the events, and there was like a howitzer fight T-shirt, and wasn't that one of those companies that got in a little bit of trouble for some of the things they said? So there was some weird attachments, especially in this area of California, because
Yeah.
you get a mixed bag there for sure.
You get that inland empire to, like, randoms from Mexico, like Olaf Alonso. And I'm nothing against my Mexican brothers or sisters, by the way. I'm just saying, like, you drew from a large, there was a lot of variables.
Oh yeah.
A lot of meth areas, fighters from meth areas, we'll say. A lot of Breaking Bad area fighters in a Breaking Bad era of MMA.
Let's just say in the early days of the WEC, when Nick Diaz fought there, he was one of the good boys.
Totally, yeah, totally. Yep, that's right, that's right. Oh man, all right. Well, that was a good number 5. My number 5 is a much newer WEC, and this one could easily be on anybody's list. I don't know how hipster of a pick it is for me, but it is a pick based on just being technical. And even though one of the fighters wasn't technical in the way like, I guess like Joe Rogan would say technical, like, a Martin Kampman holding his hands up or whatever, like, those fighters that Rogan would fawn over for being technical. And I'm not hating on him for doing so, but I'm just saying, like, in a different way. Both guys were technical in their own odd ways, but that was Dominic Cruz and Joseph Benavidez. They had 2 great fights, Brad. I am talking about the one at WEC 50 because it was a 5-round fight. And more specifically, both are great fights, but it's not just because we get 2 extra rounds of what was a great matchup between 2 unorthodox guys. You got Benavidez shifting, one of the first guys doing shifting, corralling combos to chopping leg kicks, striking from odd angles from the southpaw stance that gave a lot of guys trouble. But you also have Dominic Cruz, who's coming into his own, right? He's really kind of on his way to final form Cruz as far as being ahead of and he's really ahead of the pack, whether you like Cruz or like his style or not. You can't deny that guy was ahead of the pack. And in the second fight in particular, and I'll let you weigh in here, Brad, why I like it is because you see them countering all the stuff from the first fight. And that's one thing I love about the WEC. You don't just get fun style parody, but you get a lot of, like, storyline parody. You get a lot of storylines between a lot of guys, whether it was a 2-fight saga, 3-fight saga, etc. But they all have their own storylines outside of the cage, and more specifically with this fight, it was inside of the cage. Dominic Cruz is one of my favorite takedowns, the knee tap takedown. Sometimes he would go Barza guard variation off a chain, but he was owning guys, and he still did really well even in the UFC. One of the few guys to take down Dillashaw in his prime, etc. But you see Joseph Benavidez have a counter for the knee tap takedown, and you just see, like, them playing off each other, man. And it was a split decision. I agree with the decision, but it's always nice to say as a Benavidez fan, or if you're a Benavidez fan for a while, he only lost, like, close decisions to or maybe plus the knockout to Demetrius Johnson, to some of the best pound for pound fighters. And this is one you can hang your hat on, even in a loss for Joseph Benavidez. It was a great fight.
Yeah, this is another one because, a little while after, obviously, when Dominic Cruz went to the UFC, he fought DJ in that versus fight. And it was another one where, obviously, there was a huge size disparity, but these guys showed you, like Benavidez and Mighty Mouse in those fights showed you just how good they were, that they were fighting 10 pounds up. And even as flyweights, they're not big flyweights, and they hung with the best bantamweight in the world. And, when you're talking about Dominic Cruz, I know that people say sometimes that he's the greatest bantamweight of all time, but I really think that he kind of gets undersold because people don't necessarily like his style, all the injuries, obviously, so you don't get the same amount of activity that you get out of other guys. But the fact that Dominic Cruz was pretty much wiping everybody out at this point, and not necessarily like finishing them all or doing anything like that, but he was difficult to hit. He was almost impossible to take down. Like it was tough to look good when you were fighting against Dominic Cruz, and you saw Benavidez come in this fight, and this goes for a few other WC matchups, like you said, where it was really just a continuation and the evolution of their first fight. You saw the same sort of thing with WC 48, Benuelos and Jorgensen in their rematch. It didn't look like round one when they came out. They started going at it, and it was like, oh, this is round 4. And then obviously you had like the Cerrone Varner storylines and that sort of stuff, where that was, it continued on from their first fight. So you see that a lot in the WEC, and you see a lot more of that evolution. It feels like guys really adapted to their surroundings really well. That's an awesome pick.
Yeah, definitely. And there's another one, but I don't want to jump in because it almost made my list, so maybe it's on yours. I won't touch it, but it's a higher weight class narrative as well, from about the middle days. But yeah, I'm glad I figured you'd appreciate that one as well. But yeah, well put. And again, I'm not going to go on my Dominic Cruz rant for the sake of people's ears, but I'm glad someone else as well has that opinion who I respect. Because again, whether you like him or like his style or not, it's hard to deny what he's done, and when you list out his stats, I think it surprises a lot of people, even some hardcores, when you really like step back and look at how long his career spans through.
Yeah, and the thing about like this time period too, Cruz was always trying to shake that quick loss to Faber. That he had when he challenged for the it was
the
debut.
WEC at least.
Yes, and challenged for the featherweight title right off the bat, and it was just, Faber has that guillotine. He landed that guillotine with regularity back in that time, and that was just what happened. But it seemed like he was always trying to shake the reputation that he picked up in that loss, and I think eventually he got there. But this is still during that time period where people were like, yeah, but he got subbed by Faber in like a minute, so whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
And the other crazy thing about this fight... Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
This didn't even win Fight of the Night on this card. I'm looking at it right now.
Which card was this?
This WC 50. The Cruz Benavidez fight.
Yeah.
It actually went to Scott Jorgensen and Brad Pickett that night.
Oh, wow. Scotty Jorgensen threw on some fun fights back in the day. Don't sleep on him, folks. He was an action fighter, too. That was fun because with the WEC, you just get a lot of fun style fights. And wrestle boxers were part of the equation, and I'm not going to jaw on because we'll naturally get into the rest as we push forward. But yeah, you're number 4, sir. As we push on, it is your turn. You at the steering wheel now. What ended up making your cut for number 4?
All right, so number 4, Canadian. I'm biased. I've got to get some of that CanCon in there, that Canadian content. So my number 4 is going to be WEC 49, their only trip to Canada. And this was, they sort of unofficially called it the Canadian Featherweight Championship at the time. This was Mark Hominick and Yves, as they said, Jabway. I'm sure he cringed every time he heard that, but Mark Hominick and Yves Jabouin, WEC 49, the first round of this fight is just absolutely sublime striking. As far as, we talk about MMA and MMA striking a lot and how guys are usually good at like one or two things. But you've got Yves Jabouin, who is one of the best fighters at actually mixing punches and kicks in combinations. Oh, yeah. He could throw elbows in there as well, switch stances, go all 3 levels. This guy could do everything on the feet. And then you've got Hominick, who as a striker, he's always willing to stand in the pocket and he's willing to try and use his head movement and slip some shots. And just fire right back. So this was a perfect match. I know that they were trying to make this in Canada for a long, long time. So the fact that they finally got it done and it turned into the fight that it did, where I was talking about the striking in the first round, which is back and forth. It was really, really fun to watch. But the finish to this fight is incredible. I know that Hominick, Joanne starts to get tired a little bit in the second round because the pace these guys were on was just absolutely torrid. Drops him with a liver shot. Yep. So I know you love that. Punches. Even when he's going for some follow-up shots again, he lands like a knee to the liver as Jabouin's up against the cage and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden, Jabouin's like, all right, I've had enough of this. He comes out, he clips him with a huge right. Hominick drops. Jabouin jumps on top of him, and then Hominick hits. You don't think of him as a grappler, but this is a guy submitted Eve Edwards in the UFC back at the height, well, maybe not the height of Eve's powers, but pretty close to that peak of Eve. So he's got a little bit of grappling in him. He hits a beautiful sweep, gets on top, and manages to finish the fight. And it's like 7 or 8 minutes, but just action-packed, perfect mix of everything as the WEC was.
I think the sweep that I think this was before we went on air. The sweep I was trying to find and pluck out of my mind, it was this sweep, I'm pretty sure, because I'm pretty sure it's a flower/pendulum sweep variation of sorts. Yeah. And that's it, man. This is a great. I'm glad you made it your number 4 because it is my number 4. I couldn't avoid putting this one on. I'm sure listeners knew this was going to be on my list somewhere, so it couldn't have worked out perfect that we landed on this one. And this is one that I figured we would have because, again, I'm having a Canadian on my show. But this was a Canadian turf war in the making. This was on my Fight Vault Top 5 Featherweight Wars. It will stay there. And the funny thing is, Jabouin was probably a bantamweight, as I'm mispronouncing his name as well. But he was.
You're doing better than Todd Harris.
Yeah. So but I used to get Todd Harris and what was the other guy confused so much when I was watching him back in the day until I saw him do the post-fight interview. Then I would realize who it was.
Okay.
Who was the other guy?
Yeah.
Who's the guy that was a really California bro? Hey man, just came from the California Pizza Kitchen and you look great. No, I don't know why I'm shitting on the guy. He's great, but he just looks like a total. I'll have to look it up.
He was a versus guy though, right?
Yeah, and he was a total California guy too. He was whether you're a non-American or an American stereotyping a Californian, you're right.
Craig Hummer.
Yes.
Craig Hummer.
Yeah. And he seemed like such a great guy, by the way. I'm not shitting on him, but he was just like, hey, you're right, man. You look really great for the guillotine.
I got nothing on that.
I don't know why. I remember the cadences so well. Someone was talking about Gus Johnson. My favorite Gus Johnson thing. I know everyone shits on Gus, but my favorite thing was when he would double say the first name as he would slowly step into frame. He'd be like, Misha. That was I would lose it every time. That was the Gus Johnson fucking cadence.
You know what? We did an Elite XC card recently on our MMA Analysis rewatch, and we were like, you know what, Gus Johnson, he had those couple moments, granted where things just went off the rail. The makeup job towards the end was like that makeup shotgun in The Simpsons.
Yes.
But, generally he did for a guy who didn't know MMA, he did a pretty good job. So I can't shit on him too much.
He did, and he was good within his realm. But back to this fight and back to Eves, what I liked about Eves, you said mixing up all 3 levels. We talk about guys like Barbosa and Marlon Moraes, who to different degrees are still doing very well, right? They're still very much in relevant, what is today, modern day, or relevant to now. And they're still one of the few guys, even in the year of 2020, Brad, who can kick going backwards, who can kick to counter, right? And Eves was one of the few guys who's doing that, and he's doing it over 10 years ago, over a decade ago. He's doing that in high-level mixed martial arts fights. Not against nobodies either. And you see a lot of that kind of a kick and body kick as far as his body offerings. Of course, they weren't as good as Hominick's, but, Eves is right there too. And it's just a fantastic fight. I've gone on about it so much. People know how I feel. But what I will kind of cap off is, man, I was watching a lot of old school Team Tompkins fights, and I was kind of getting down. Now, I I wasn't nearly as close at all with Sean Tompkins as I was with Robert Follis. But Sean Tompkins, of course, especially toward the end of the career, they had a real, I think, Extreme Couture Vancouver. We had obviously ties, Extreme Couture Las Vegas, the two main Extreme Coutures, obviously Las Vegas being the main one. So we would see a young Chris Wardesky, Sam Stout. Hominick, not as much, admittedly. He had more ties at a different part of Canada that you probably know better on. But we would see a lot of those guys. I was able to take classes. I was lucky enough to take classes from Sean Tompkins, both striking and MMA. And so I always rooted for these guys, right? I always had a soft spot for this Canadian contingent. And it's always a bummer for me going back to watch. And not because Follis had a much closer relationship, so I just kind of get bummed if I have to see that in general. But, like, Tompkins, not as much a close connection, but I still feel for him because it was, A, a sad story, and B, which we won't really get into because I think Tompkins makes it, he makes it into the, he's alive for all of the WEC career. But for those who follow these fighters, whether it's Hominick or other fighters we might talk about here, folks, they all went on this crazy downturn as soon as, like, Sean Tompkins died. And I was like, oh, yeah. And we saw a bit of that, too, with Follis and a lot of the fighters that he was coaching. And it was just crazy. It was this whole, like, deja vu for me. I'm sorry to sidetrack, folks, but it was kind of crazy for me.
That's all right. I remember, obviously you're very close to Follis. My first ever MMA interview was with Dave Jansen. During the interview, he couldn't speak more glowingly of Robert Follis. So I never had a chance to interact with him, but I can tell just from having spoke to other people just how special that dude was. And obviously, as far as Canadian MMA goes, you've got the whole Montreal scene, which kind of speaks for itself, GSP and all those guys. But then after that, it was Team Tompkins and sort of that London area, which is like an hour away from where I live. So really sort of close, and growing up, those were a lot of the guys that I started to gravitate towards in terms of my fandom.
Absolutely. And if you're going to stereotype, like, okay, Brazil, you're probably going to have jiu-jitsu. Russia, you're probably going to have sambo. Like, for people that don't realize, like, as far as combat sports goes, I don't know how underrated or unheralded, depends on how closely you're following, but Canada's always, Montreal has its own scene, kind of, but Canada's always had a nice selection of kickboxers as far as combat sports goes. Kickboxers who could box, kickboxers that could go in a traditional Muay Thai and would compete there. So for us people, for people watching MMA, and we're aware of Canada's martial arts presence, you were kind of waiting for, okay, when are the kickboxers going to start invading in? And I think Sean Tompkins' crew was a great example as far as a flag bearer for that for you guys.
Definitely. It's just a shame that it ended a little bit prematurely, a lot prematurely.
Absolutely.
But that's part of the game.
Since we have a crossover, do you want to do a Chinese fire drill? And I'll just go with my number 3 to kick us off for the next part of this.
Yeah.
All right. My number 3 is a really obvious one. It's probably going to be on everybody's list. It would probably be a very common one, maybe for a number 1, I could say. And the hipster in me wants to leave it off for that reason, Brad. Perhaps that's why it falls on number 3. You know where I'm going?
I think I know where you're going.
Okay, you probably know where I'm going. But the thing is, I can't because, like, again, I consider myself a tough noob, even though there were fights, perhaps even main cards at certain times when we're talking about Ortiz and Shamrock that I watched before the Tough series. I'm not going to front. I wasn't one of these people, like I think I was talking about on the light heavyweight episode with Simon Head. Like, I wasn't calling my friends on the phone like Griffin's fighting Bonner, right? Like, I can't say that I have that story, Brad. But the closest thing I have to that story happens to be an amazing fight, and that is Leonard Garcia versus Chan Sung Jung, Korean Zombie, number 1. Obviously, we're talking about WEC 48. And you'll definitely chime in here with me on the card, maybe tell me where your placement is. But let me just kind of set up what I mean by the unique portion of me, why this is my pick as far as the setup, the Forrest Griffin Bonner comparison. So basically, I was at a house party, right? And there was alcohol. I remember there was like a table full of edibles, like a bunch of like really good cookies. And I didn't have a problem with eating those, by the way, but I remember like eating like 3 before realizing they were edibles. I'm like, wow, okay, this is going to be... So just a precursor to set the table.
This is going to be a wild night, yeah.
These guys were like these weren't even like MMA casuals. There wasn't many people there who even followed MMA. It was pretty much me and my buddy Joe, shout out to Joe Vernola, I think, we're just the only ones watching the prelims, right? Because this was the last fight leading in, and really smart. I'm sure Sean Shelby fucking still pats himself on the back, and he deserves so for, because the lead-in fight is so important, for selling. Yep. You could argue that the lead-in fight is almost just as important as the headlining fight and leaving the taste in your mouth as far as sales goes. Perhaps not for the whole card, obviously, but for a matchmaker perspective as far as what makes a successful card. This is an important one to watch. And at the moment, there's an illegal poker game going on with some money going down. Not the highest stakes, but for the guys I'm hanging out with, pretty high stakes, right? Okay? And so that's got the attention, right? And you've got people in different parts of the room. This fight starts, Brad. 2 people are watching. Me and my buddy Joe, like I said. By the 3rd round, the poker game is stopped. Everybody is stopped. The girls who don't give a shit about fighting, they didn't care about the other fights, which there were some really good fights on this card, which hopefully we'll talk about. Some that don't get talked about because WEC 48 was so packed. Everybody was watching this fight by the end of it, and it was we just couldn't believe what we saw. It wasn't the most technical fight, but it's probably the closest, as lame as that story is. It's the closest for me as far as a Stephan Bonner call up your friend moment. You just saw people slowly bumping each other's shoulder. Check this out. You saw people slowly losing their focus on what they were doing and focusing on the TV. I haven't been able to recreate it since. It's got to be on this list.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of fights that capture that sort of attention. Dana's got his whole 4 corners, soccer, basketball, that sort of stuff in a fight. But this is one of those, if that fight is on the 4th corner, everyone is going to that corner. Some other fights, maybe not. But this fight was incredible. And I wasn't a long-term WEC fan going back to the HDNet days, just because we didn't have HDNet in Canada until after WEC was already on Versus, or here in Canada TSN. So I didn't really start to get into it until the events in the 30s and stuff like that. But going back as far as I could in my live viewing of the WEC to watch it build up to the point where they could do a pay-per-view. Well, WEC couldn't do a pay-per-view, but the UFC could present a pay-per-view on their behalf.
Yeah.
But getting to that point and seeing the stuff that had already happened on the undercard, because you've got, I'm not sure if that's when Chad Mendes makes his debut in the WEC, but I know he's on the undercard and he basically rips a dude's head off. You've got Pickett beating DJ on that undercard. Pettis winning with one of his 17 triangle chokes that he had in the WEC. Seemed like that dude finished everybody in the 2nd or 3rd round with a triangle. And then you cap it all off with this.
Oh, totally.
And just absolutely losing your mind. As you said, it wasn't the most technical of fights, but these were 2 guys that, Chen Sun Jung, I had known him from the Sengoku featherweight tournament at this point. I think he was in a couple fights over there. Didn't necessarily have the greatest results. But Leonard Garcia, you knew he was coming into brawl. So it turned out pretty couldn't have been better as far as, like you said, Sean Shelby was concerned, and to lead into their only pay-per-view.
Totally. And, as you touched on the card there, perfect, because, one of Demetrius Johnson's only losses was on there to Brad Pickett, who's always been a favorite of mine personally. I've always been a big Brad Pickett fan. But on those 3 cards that I wanted to highlight as far as top to bottom, the most stacked cards, WEC 48 is one of those next to, as Brad mentioned off the top of the show, WEC 35. But WEC 48 is right there too.
Yeah.
Awesome, man. Awesome. Well, that one wasn't on your list, huh? And no problem if it wasn't, by the way. I'm not judging.
It was not on my list.
Okay.
I went a little too hipster and kept it off the list. I think it might be the decision that does it for me. Because sometimes, you in this case, it's okay because Korean Zombie got it back in the UFC in their rematch. But still, just watching that fight and then seeing the decision play out the way it did, we were in that Leonard Garcia, Diego Sanchez sort of period where if it went to decision, they were getting the decision. That's how life went.
Totally,
It was like Omagawa by must decision back then. But my this one didn't make my top 5, but it was certainly right at the top of the honorable mention list.
I love how even in the highlights, Garcia's missing every punch.
Yeah.
But I could see how like judges got bullshitted because it was also Garcia had that Greg Jackson thing where even if it wasn't landed, where you're throwing spitting shit at the end, last 10 seconds of every round, and you're swaying all the stupid judges in your favor. So that was really common, like at its peak back then.
Leave an impression. Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. What was your number three then, sir? That was my number three.
So my number three is, we've talked a little bit about Asian fighters to this point, but now we're going to get into a Japanese fighter, and not one who gets much acclaim. So there's a couple other guys, and I'm sure we'll talk about one of them for sure at some point in this podcast, just because I know that having listened to a couple of the shows, it's pretty easy to get Dan into a rant on Takei Mizugaki. But
shout out to my buddy Jordan Killian too, by the way. He's all about the Mitsugaki fan club. Go on, sorry.
Yeah, but this fight is from the aforementioned WEC 35, and this is Carlos Condit defending his welterweight title against Hiromitsu Miura. So this fight is, especially if you don't know anything about Miura, this fight is absolutely shocking to go in and watch because, he's got like a decent record. His like career MMA record's only like 9-4, 9-5. He went off and did some boxing after that. I think he got to the point where he challenged for some sort of lower level world title over in Japan in boxing. So he had a decent boxing career. But this guy, he was a boxer and a judoka, and he comes out in this fight and his first round is actually pretty dominant over Condit. He lands a bunch of throws, lands some heavy strikes. Obviously, we know that Condit can take a shot, and there's not a lot of quitting that dude. So he just keeps coming back for more and more and more and more. And honestly, Condit was great in the UFC, and his fight with Robbie Lawler, especially that fifth round, that will go down in the history books as one of the best ever. But where he really cultivated that reputation was his WEC run.
Absolutely.
He wasn't necessarily fighting the top welterweights in the world at this time, but if you saw a welterweight ranking list in sort of the 2006, 2008 time period before he made that jump over to UFC, and it didn't have him in the top 10, people would be like, whoa, well, what are you doing? Like, where's Carlos Condit? This guy's phenomenal. And in this fight, he shows a lot of heart. He shows a lot of his skills, and he shows just how reckless he was, because this is back when he was at Fit NHB as opposed to going over to the counterparts in Albuquerque. But he takes a lot of stuff, and he dishes it back, and there are probably 3 or 4 times in this fight where I'm like, oh, Miura's done. Like, he's got nothing left in the tank, and then he pops up, lands another little judo throw, and starts raining down some ground and pound again, and you're like, holy shit. And again, it's one of those fights I found with a lot of the fights that I really, really loved in the WEC, that a lot of the finishes left something to be desired. And I think this one, compared to what these guys went through for the previous 3 whatever rounds, the stoppage here was a bit weak, especially seeing how many times Miura bounced back, but it's hard to argue with this fight as a whole. So this is my number 3.
Yeah, it's one of those where it's like, and they even say it in the commentary, the finishing knee wasn't like have a lot of gusto on it, but no one was complaining, and not even Miura. And it's funny because in the pre-fight package, like Carlos Condit actually he's talking about, he's like, my knee's gonna win it for me. And by the way, you sunk my battleship. This is my next one, number 2. So we're still right on the same. We're still right on. I like it though, because we're still right on the same lines. And I'm sure listeners of this podcast know that's going to go on here. By the way, before I launch into this fight with you and touch on your points, I want to touch on one point you brought up, which is great. I totally forgot, and I did know this, and I did recently rewatch this yet again. Like, I haven't watched this fight enough. But yeah, he's with Fit NHB, which is Tom and Arlene Vaughn. And Arlene Vaughn, actually, surprisingly, is the striking coach. Tom Vaughn can strike, more of a catch wrestling guy. I like Tim Means a lot, and Tim Means is a super technical striker, so it's kind of funny. I always wanted to see, perhaps maybe I'll talk about that in fights that never happened. I don't know if this was ever close to happening, but I always wanted to see that fight, the Tim Means versus Carlos Condit in the UFC.
Yep.
But as you mentioned that, it's funny because when I was rewatching that, I'm like, I don't remember Carlos Condit having this much of a jab, but this was before he went to Jackson, so that's what
Yep.
happened to the jab. But shade. I'm not trying to throw shade, by the way, just being honest. I mean, right?
It's true. Like you see it, and it's against as far as boxers go, it's against probably one of the top 4 or 5 boxers that he's fought in his MMA career too.
Right, and outside of his knees, I didn't realize that the jab would be one of his more popular strikes. But back to the style matchup, and back to Japanese fighters, like you opened this, Brad. I like it because Japanese fighters, and I think I talked to this. We didn't talk, by the way, that much pre-pod, and I tried not to. We tried to save it for the pod, but I think we talked about this pre-pod again, Brad, where Japanese fighters played a really interesting role in WEC and MMA at this time because before WEC, or even I should say during WEC, we're going back to their beginning, right, 2001, till even now in the UFC, right, 2000 onward, Japanese fighters have traditionally struggled, both stereotypically and but factually, right, in Western North American organizations. If that's not painting with too broad a brush, right? That's fair. But it was great because WEC knew how to use these guys, though. Whereas even though they weren't doing Japanese-style rules or doing Japanese-style matchmaking, they use these Japanese fighters in the way that Japanese promoters would also use these fighters as far as win or lose, we know you're really good for an action fight. Hence guys like Takeyu Mitsugaki, which I'm sure we'll talk about more before this episode's over. But that's what I really liked about the Japanese fighters they brought over because lest we not forget, folks, Pride is still operating in the beginning of the WEC, and even organizations like Dream and Deep are still putting on really good fucking fights, pardon my French, during this time. So it's funny, like WEC, arguably, even though these fighters were still taking L's, if we probably put it at a pie chart, majority still probably took L's. I would argue WEC more than Strikeforce, UFC, Bellator, now or then. They utilize the Asian talent the best as far as their matchmaking with North American fighters. Is that? Would you agree with that, Brad? Or
I think so because you look at the promotions and you see not only the best performances out of the Japanese fighters, but the most exciting fights, and it really looks like these guys did their homework as far as bringing in the Japanese fighters. Like,
right.
You talked about Takeya Mizugaki, and Takeya Mizugaki, as obviously, he's Japanese. He came up in like Deep and what was their counterpart that actually used the cage at the time? GCM.
Yes.
Greatest common multiple, where they like had a tournament in the cage and stuff like that. And it was really novel for Japanese MMA at the time. I don't really think of him as a Japanese style fighter in terms of the techniques that he employs. You talked about like wrestle boxers earlier, and that's really sort of his archetype as a fighter. But they knew how to bring him in and who to put him against, and how you'd get that awesome sort of clinch war that he had. So, not to step on a particular fight too much, right. But like they really knew where to bring these guys in, where to place them. They sort of knew that Miura's base and his boxing would really give Condit trouble in this fight. I'm not sure they thought it would give him this much trouble, but they were able to pick and choose these guys and really make hay with in North American MMA a talent pool that really hadn't been tapped to that point, both in terms of the geographical location and in terms of the weight classes.
Totally, and Mitsugaki definitely had that more wrestle boxing style, which wasn't not necessarily uncommon for fighters to have. I was talking about stylistic matchups and just wrestle boxers in general. You had Eddie Alvarez for an American one versus Tatsuya Kawajiri versus the Japanese style of it, right?
Yeah.
And it was either that or, kind of rounding back to the matchup we're talking about, judo boxers. Again, judo and wrestling, they both, like I was talking about on the live chat where they both rely heavily on their bases. You're aware of your base because that is your base martial art that you've been training in. You're not going to be so readily to leave your feet. Not that Mira or another fighter I'm going to talk about for my number one weren't throwing kicks per se. They weren't necessarily strictly judo boxers or wrestle boxers, but man, did did it mix well, because not just using the Asians, because again, if you look at Mira, or the fighter I'm going to mention in my number one, to prove the point, what you just said as well, Brad, as far as they knew how to pick their spots. You look at Mira, or the guy I'm going to talk about for my number one, their best moments were in the WEC, whereas it's the inverse in other organizations, whereas the Japanese fighter had the big name, everybody was excited, but by the time, or not even being too late, whenever they did come over, it was usually a bust in some shape or form. You know what I'm saying? Whereas the Japanese fighters in WEC, to kind of seal this point, they overperformed, and their records, that's what the records state.
Yeah, I was actually just going back to one of your previous shows. I think it was with my fellow Canadian Aaron Braunstetter, where it was top 5 prospects that didn't pan out, and the big one for me was Hatsu Hioki, and nobody has that sort of career trajectory better than Hioki. Like, that dude looked like the best featherweight in the world when he was over in Japan, save for Aldo maybe at the time, and I was so excited to try and watch that fight. Obviously, it never ended up happening, but that's exactly what you're talking about, where a guy looks like an absolute world beater outside of the North American promotions, UFC, however you want to say it, and then comes over and it's just sort of like, oh, that was disappointing.
Absolutely. By the way, shout out to HDNet for my sister's HDNet subscription, where she didn't know that one of the only reasons why I went to babysit for her in the mid to late aughts was because she had an HDNet subscription. So I got to see like Hatsu Hioki, Ryan Jimmo's RIP. Speaking of fighters, we were talking about like all these like different, like whether it was like MFC or like Dream or like other organizations. Like it was just fun. Marlon Sandro, got to see a lot of him on some HDNet.
Yeah.
But back to this fight, and we talked about the Japanese aspect, but just to cap it off, the stylistic aspect, again, not to retread too much ground, but this is one of my favorite style fights, and in MMA in general, you know? Like, we talk about Frank Shamrock in the late 90s, where you start finally seeing certain fighters start mixing the martial arts, but usually the style fights are one style versus one style for the most part in the 90s, right, Brad? But in this aughts, like the 2000 to 2010 and WEC era, you get the prime two styles versus two styles. And again, my favorite two styles versus two styles is no better represented in the fight that we're getting off track kind of a bit, my fault. But Carlos Condit versus Mira, you get Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu, which again, it makes sense they go together. If you're going to throw kicks, you're going to be taken down more. You better have good jiu-jitsu. And if you throw kicks, it means you probably have decent leg dexterity. You like to use your legs. So if you're smart, you're fighting MMA, you probably developed your guard before you're wrestling. Hence, you saw a lot of Muay Thai jiu-jitsu guys. And again, as we just explained, I won't retread the ground why wrestling, boxing, or in this case, judo and boxing go so well together. And you mix those two together, and it's great because you get the boxer putting a heavy amount of weight on his lead leg, so he's getting opened up for leg kicks, getting picked on the inside. So he's like, I got to go inside now. And he starts bombing on the tall, lanky Muay Thai guy with punches, and the Muay Thai guy's like, oh no, I got to clench him. And then he starts kneeing him, and the judo guy's like, oh, I can't get kneed. I'm going to toss you on your head. Yeah. And then now you're in this fucking guard, and it's a scramble session. So like certain fucking matchups, man, stylistically just breed great fights, and they knew that combo. Shelby knew that fucking combo, and you got it in spades here, folks. WEC 35, one of the best WEC cards.
Yeah, and I just have to say that as far as MMA visuals go, nothing gets my pants on the ceiling quicker than a perfectly executed judo throw.
Yes.
So,
oh yeah,
it's just like, show me a clip of GSP Hughes 3 on repeat where he just ends up like right inside mount, full weight right on Hughes' chest, or a bunch of the examples from Miura Condit, and man, that's the way to my heart.
Oh, so good. Great. I'm glad you had this one on your list. All right, so
I'm sorry I stole it from you.
No, it's all good. That was my number 2, which was your number 3. I already gave my number 3. So let's do another Chinese fire drill. And why don't you fire off what you had for your number 2?
All right. My number 2, we're going to head to the lightweight division for this one. And just saying that doesn't really narrow it down.
No,
because there's like a million lightweight fights. I know in the comments to you posting this episode on Twitter and some other places, there's some lightweight fights that people have suggested. But the one I'm going with here, I was almost not even going to have this on my list at all. And then I watched it again earlier today and I was just like, this fight is nuts. It's Benson Henderson and Donald Cerrone at WEC 43. And again, this probably didn't make a lot of other people's lists, but I absolutely love this fight. I really enjoy, like, MMA these days has sort of evolved to a point where the tactics have come into play in such a huge way that you don't see guys willing to be too aggressive when they get into grappling exchanges or sacrifice position or things like that. Whereas when you go back to the heyday of these guys, and it was really kind of a staple of the WEC as a whole, guys were willing to go for anything from any position. And within the first minute and a half of this fight, you've got Cerrone locking up that ridiculous power guillotine, making Henderson sacrifice position. He gets on top, switches it immediately to a triangle. Then you've got Benson, because he saw Cerrone's previous fights with Varner, where staying in tight to him and letting him work the close guard on you is really going to be trouble. So he was standing up in his guard. He was dropping punches from there, dropping elbows to the body. There's a point where Cerrone just has a full-on armbar in this fight, and Henderson's like, yeah, that's cool. I think I made a note of somewhere in the third round where it's the only time that I've really noticed in a fight Henderson actually adjusting his toothpick during the fight. Usually he was pretty good at keeping that in check, but in this fight, these guys were so all over the place that even the toothpick came out of place, so he had to adjust that. And then, like, it carries through all the way to the fight. You get into rounds 4 and 5, and suddenly Donald Cerrone, who couldn't defend a takedown to save his life, has got like Aldo's takedown defense, and he's just like shucking Henderson off of these deep double legs, and I don't know how he managed to do it, but he really takes over the fight late. The 5th round, he looks like he's using Henderson's arm as like a lever to try and just like rip it off in some of these crazy omoplata attempts that he's got. And then eventually Henderson just survives it all, and we go to a decision. And this one, I couldn't shit on this decision like the Korean Zombie Garcia decision, because this one you can really see it going either way. Henderson ends up getting the decision. He becomes the WC interim lightweight champion, because they were waiting for Jamie Varner to get over his eye issue at the time, and went on to quite the run himself in terms of what he did for the rest of his WEC tenure, and then obviously over in the UFC as well. So Donald Cerrone, Ben Henderson won, WEC 43.
Man, that's a great fight. That's toward the top of my list here as well, because Ben Henderson, I think he had, off the top of my head, a couple fights, 2 or 3 before this, but even though I was watching the WEC at this time, Brad, I wasn't aware of Ben Henderson. Like, he slipped through my radar. So this was my introduction to Benson Henderson, my introduction to certain things. Like, I like the shouts to like the body ground and pound. But what was crazy was not that Benson Henderson slipped my radar, but it was because he actually had a lot of fun finishes. In fact, which is people don't realize, Benson Henderson, this was only the second time in his entire career that he goes to decision. All but one of his fights were all by finish before this. So it was a trip. And if you don't give Benson Henderson enough credit, I know I've been guilty of that. I just don't think he gets enough credit in general for what you can give him credit for. From funny stuff like the toothpick, great shout, Brad, to his overall career, like. Go back and watch some of these early fights, man. You see why Benson Henderson has the respect and the hardcore fans that he does have, for sure. You can't discredit Benson for this chapter of his career at all.
No, and back in this day, he was just a wild man. Like I said about sacrificing position and really going for it, he would do that at all costs. So it made his fights really fun. It opened him up and gave his opponents something to work with as well, which made his fights even more fun. And he had that finishing ability that, as he consistently fought the top guys in the world, kind of waned. But I still think that even though he went to a bunch of decisions as his career started to progress, he was still in generally entertaining fights, but nothing towards this the WEC peak in terms of like from the 40s into the end of the WEC. That was just a wild ride.
Yeah, Benson Henderson has a weird style that, although it's different than John Fitch's, I find myself oddly sympathetic toward both their styles for the same reason why people shit on them. Because don't get me wrong, like as a grappler, as a martial artist, of course in your head you want to be the athletic dude who finishes everybody, but I'm obviously not athletic, and my finishing abilities were not great. We're talking about fights here. But I found myself, like, to the John Fitch reference, I found myself doing a lot of positional dominance and having a lot of grinding nature to my game. So I found myself having a hard time hating on John Fitch and jumping on that train as far as that goes. And for Benson Henderson, when you bringing back to this fight, you almost wonder when you look back at it, was like, is this where he gets a taste for the close fights? Because you can argue with Benson Henderson that he allowed fights to get closer, whether you think he should have won some splits or not. There's that argument too, but there's also this other overarching argument that perhaps he let fights go a little too closer than they needed to, because this is a very talented and well-rounded guy through almost all iterations of his career. And of course, one of the fun parts of this is watching him get out of all of Donald Cerrone submissions. And again, not trying to relate myself to a pro fighter by any meaningful way, but the context here, there is a certain high when you reverse or get out of bad positions or out of submissions. And I would almost, not to sound like Gene LaBelle, I get off on choking people out, but I would almost get off on that. Like when I was revisiting my roll sessions, even if I got a submission, I wasn't revisiting the submission or making the guy tap. I was thinking back to, like, that was so awesome when I got out of that bad position, because that was more rewarding. And that's fine. It is more rewarding, but if you're in a prize fight, you don't want to get into those positions when you don't have to. And I almost feel like Benson Henderson almost develops this bad habit, consciously or not, as he goes on into the WEC to this decision/split decision king.
Yeah, and you can almost see it, like, how far can I take this before somebody can actually get me, right?
Yeah.
And I don't have near the grappling pedigree or time put into the grappling that you do, but one of my favorite things about grappling is, like, all right, try and submit me. Like, see if you can try and just, like, seeing people get frustrated as they can't do it. And they're just like, dude, like, what the fuck are you made of? Like, how did you stretch like that? How did you not go out from that? It's you can definitely see, as somebody who's experienced that on a very, very minor level, how doing that to a top flight professional fighter might be able to get in their head a little bit, and you can take some joy out of that.
Well, which is why, to add on to that point and cap it off, which is why, not stepping on anything because this is UFC, by the time Benson Henderson gets to the UFC and he's defending his title against Nate Diaz, it's just extra rewarding when Benson Henderson tries to do his Van Damme impression by going into a full split to avoid the leg lock, and then Diaz's counter is just flipping him off, forcing the broadcast to go off air momentarily on Fox, which is great.
That's a great shout.
I think that's like only like their fifth show. I think that's like Fox 5 or something. Like, it's like they're still new to the Fox relationship, and they're rolling the dice on throwing Nate Diaz out there. It's great.
Yeah.
That's a good pick, sir. That's a really good pick. Okay, my number 2, obviously I already gave, which was Condit Mitsumura. So I guess I'll launch us into our number 1, shall we? And maybe we're on the same number 1 here, but we were talking a lot again about portending a lot about Asian fighters in certain stylistic matchups, and I think this one checks both boxes. This is WEC 34, which is another good card, but not the third one I'm going to recommend to you folks. I'll do that at the end. But this was for the bantamweight title. This was Miguel Torres versus Yoshiro Maeda, who, again, I had such high hopes for this guy after this fight, but kind of the point we just talked about. A lot of these guys topped out in the WEC. This was Maeda's top in a loss. Loses by third round doctor stoppage. And is this how good the fights are, by the way? Because there is some controversial, like you mentioned Varner Cerrone, this fight. There are stoppages where, like, if a fight ends controversially or by doctor stoppage, it's immediately controversial, even by today's standards in the UFC fights. And it'll take, even like Cerrone fucking Ferguson, like, great fights, people will be like, oh, the fight sucked now because it ended controversially. Like, the WEC fights were so good that controversial endings are on my fucking top 5 list. You know what I'm saying?
Yep, exactly. You're exactly right. This fight, I'm sure you'll get into it in a little more detail. It's not my. We talked a little bit just very briefly before the show, and I was like, "There's a couple that I think you're gonna have that I left off." This was one of them that I left off, but round 2 of this fight is quite possibly my favorite MMA round of all time. It's just absolutely wild.
Absolutely, and Frank Mir, signs off with you, and it's one of those things where I'm watching in hindsight, and you totally forgive him for being live in the moment. There's always recency bias, but you're like, no, that's not recency bias. How often do you get two guys going for a double toe hold on each other in a 50-50 committed entanglement? And like Frank Mir said, it's like it's a perfect metaphor for the fight. This fight, how it was going, because I don't know what happened, Brad, but like I don't know what kind of Twitter trash talk wasn't a big thing like it is today back in 2008 or 9 or whenever this fight's going down. But like
they hated each other.
Yeah, these guys
hated each other.
In the pre-fight package, I couldn't find it, but like Maeda, through the translation, he's speaking in Japanese, right? And he essentially says the equivalent, like, I plan on taking Miguel Torres' head off and ripping out his soul. And then Miguel Torres, like, which, by the way, Miguel Torres, he says, like, some like, kind of, like, very anti-Japanese stuff. Not very anti, I'm not offended. I don't give a shit, by the way. I'm part Japanese. I'm not offended, by the way. But, like, before he fights Mitsugaki as well, he's just, I don't like these fucking Japanese fighters coming over here thinking they're better than us. And I'm like, wait a minute, Japanese fighters are, like, the least cockiest fighters ever. Like, it was so great. Which, by the way, I'm going to pass the ball to you here real quick. I didn't realize this, but... dude, does Miguel Torres, from the composure, his fight style, to what he says in interviews, I didn't realize how much of a Tony Ferguson vibe that fucking dude had, right? Holy shit.
Yeah. And even, like, his fight style isn't quite as off the wall, and training style isn't quite as off the wall as Ferguson.
Yeah, sure.
But he's still pretty out there, especially given the time that these fights were taking place, in terms of just how wild he would get. But then you would see performances like the next one after this that he had against Manny Tapia, where he's like working behind a jab a lot and just sort of like blinds Tapia on one side and really just dominates that fight. So this was a guy who, like a few MMA fighters, a little bit unstable, I think, but it worked for him. It definitely worked for him, and Maeda brought the best out of him, I think.
I mean, and this also, for people who aren't aware, I mean, this is... we grew up with as far as within MMA with certain lore and whatnot, but people that aren't aware, like Miguel Torres was like what they were trying to build Renan Barão as, and was one of the last bantamweight MMA champions who had like a 30-fight undefeated run or something along those lines. I think, what did he get, like 33 or 35 fights in a row? Not a lot were accounted for because they were like open weight fights at bars and shit, like Miguel Torres we're talking about. And he was ranked highly, and again, more deservedly so, not the whole Dana White just trying to get behind the, listen, this guy's fucking great. He washes his clothes in a sink. You never heard of him, but I promise. No. Like, Miguel Torres was like, regardless of what you thought of him or whatever, like, he was deserving of that pound for pound. He was one of the guys, because he was a lighter weight fighter, that was forcing that pound for pound talk, along with, of course, like the BJ Penns of the world, as far as in MMA.
Yeah. And this was right around the time where, obviously, Uriah Faber was at the height of his abilities as well. He headlined this card. In fact, I hate to make this comparison, but it's kind of like him versus Pulver is kind of like the WEC's Tough One moment, where it had the most eyeballs on it and two guys really just delivered. Yeah. Obviously, the fight is completely different in the sense of how it went down and the guys involved. But I saw reasonable arguments at this time for people that had Miguel Torres rated higher than Uriah Faber in terms of a pound-for-pound ranking and things like that. Like, that's the level that we're talking about right now.
And again, I don't want to step on potential submissions for top 5 fights that never happened. Like, this was something that was talked about as a fantasy fight, which was crazy because Faber would eventually go to 135 even while the WEC was still around. But of course, Miguel Torres took a pretty hard fall after the vaunted run that we just kind of built up. So we never really that talk kind of died as hard as it came, so to speak.
Yeah. If I feel like after he lost his title to Bowles, if he managed to beat Benavidez instead of losing that fight, I think that would have been the absolute perfect time to make that Faber-Torres fight. But one of those things where just the stars did not align.
Yeah, even some of those bounce back wins, like I think it might have been Charlie Valencia. I didn't go back to watch these ones, but I remember whether it was the UFC, like against Benuelos or Valencia, like they didn't feel like the inspiring. Like I'm sure they probably tried to do the "and he's back," when the commentators try to really like immediately reinstill that narrative once the fighter gets the win. Like I'm sure they tried to do that, but I just remember, and again I didn't rewatch this, but even as a Miguel Torres fan, as a fighter, I was like, I don't know if he's coming back.
Yeah, and you sort of saw it. I think that I might be in the minority here, but I think that the DJ decision. I think Miguel Torres did some phenomenal work off. I'm not sure how closely you remember that fight, but I think he did phenomenal work off his back, and I actually thought he deserved that decision. But we were at a time in MMA where if you're on the bottom, you're not winning the fight.
And it was ironic because didn't that fight go down in Japan? And it's like under Japanese rule sets, he probably would have won much more clear.
Yeah, that was the Rampage
Bader.
Hamel card.
Or Hamel?
Yeah, so that one was in Vegas.
Oh, it was Vegas. Okay, all right.
Yeah, but yeah, and I don't know. Miguel Torres, he was like a supernova. Like his rise, obviously, to get there, it took a lot. He was at like you said, 30 something and one. I know he had one loss somewhere in the middle of his early career, but then he had this like 5-fight stretch in the WEC where it was just phenomenal fight after phenomenal fight, finishing dudes, finishing Chase Beebe for the title. Yep. Great fights with Maeda, which like I've stepped all over this for you. Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good.
And then just like a couple other great defenses, Tapia and Mizugaki. And then it was just it was over. He let Brian Bowles dribble his head off the canvas a little bit and never quite got back to that level. And, it's one of the shorter but really, really high-level runs in MMA.
Yeah, when I started writing this list and compiling it, we both talked about starting our list about a week or so out. And this was the first fight I wrote, so it kind of makes sense that it was number one. But yeah, man, just the last note on it, I guess, as far as this fight or Miguel Torres goes, I've always been a big fan. I've never changed that as far as like Frank Mir's commentary style from watching these live to even going back. And of course, we can always pick on stuff. And there's a lot of like really bad flubs that all commentators make. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not trying to harp on that, but man, I forgot how biased Mir was toward Miguel Torres.
He loved Miguel Torres. That was the MMA's greatest love affair was Frank Mir and Miguel Torres. It was like people used to say the same thing about Faber in his commentary towards Faber, but against with Torres, it was just another level. Well, that's a great call.
I don't want to stop in case it's your number one, but there is a fight, not this fight, of Miguel Torres, and it's great because Todd Harris, for like literally the whole time, is trying to do the role of a play-by-play guy where you're telling the story. You're not trying to lie about what the viewers are seeing, but you are trying to curate the narrative as far as be fair. So if you notice, whether it's you or the color commentator talking too much about one guy, like, Rogan will get stuck on a narrative, not coming at Rogan, just saying he'll get stuck on his narrative, and you'll see Anik, who's so great at subtly, like, trying to re-steer it and balance it out. You see Todd Harris trying to do that every time for Miguel Torres fights for Mir, and he's like, yeah, but, I think even Miguel would admit this, Mir, that he's doing, no, but I still give the round to Miguel. Like, it was great. I just love watching Todd Harris repeatedly pitch, and he was doing Mir a favor. Yep. Like, he was giving him an out to rebalance.
Tossing up those shots.
Mir was having none of these. Like, fuck that. This is Torres' fight.
We can talk about something else when it's not Miguel Torres fighting. Like, get out of here, Todd Harris. What are you doing? Go hang out with Craig Hummer.
Yeah. Yeah, go hang out with Craig Hummer at the California Pizza Kitchen, where the fuck he's hanging out at. I don't know why I'm coming at poor Craig Hummer. I have nothing against him, by the way, but that is the image I get. What was your number one, sir, before we get off track here?
I feel like I really wanted to have Torres and Maeda as my number one. And this is a stoppage where I don't even think it's something that's controversial because, like, Maeda's orbital was blown up at that point. Yeah. Like, that was a good stoppage. I have no problem with that. But I feel like we would kind of get crucified by our listeners if one of us didn't have this fight on our lists. And it's the final fight in WC history. Mm-hmm. And what better way can you go out? Then Anthony Pettis, Ben Henderson, Showtime kick in the last 75 seconds of the fight of what was a phenomenal fight. I always love anytime you can get a fight where the best stuff happens in the championship rounds. And the fourth and fifth round in this fight, like there were obviously other high points. The entire fight is phenomenal. But the fourth and fifth round are just absolutely bonkers. Like these guys knew what was at stake. It was UFC title shot was on the line. Other than the pay-per-view, this was the biggest platform that the WEC ever had, because a lot of UFC fans really didn't come over and start watching the WEC. And then they heard, oh, this is going to get rolled into the UFC. I should probably put my eyes on this. So I don't know what the ratings numbers were for this, but it was definitely a huge platform for these fighters. And all these guys on this card, top to bottom, it's another one of those great ones that people need to go back and watch. But it seemed like they had that in mind. Like, oh, this is to go to the UFC. This is like for real. Like, we're already the best fighters in the world. We know that, but it's just a completely different stage in terms of what you can get to. And these guys gave everything they had for 25 minutes, and you get one of the most iconic moments. Like, I can only think of what would happen if something like the Showtime kick took place in 2020. With the way social media is now, just like I can't imagine everyone on the planet would see that. Like, it would just be crazy.
It had a viral effect then, and if you don't mind me just cutting in for a second here, we'll definitely go back and forth. But this was, if you're accusing me of leaving this off my list to be hipster, you are correct. You are halfway correct. However, as I want to make a note, there's a bunch of honorable mentions, and we'll knock out all of ours before we get out of here, folks. But for the truncated versions that I do in MMA Junkie, the truncated versions for this top 5 that I do called the Fight Vault, I include 2 honorable mentions. So when I do my 1 through 5, I'll write a big H on 2. So those 2 honorable mentions will stand out above the rest for what it's worth. And this fight has an H next to it, as well as Nate Diaz versus Hermes Franco, which we'll talk about later. But this is one of them, and it's because, again, first of all, like, the whole fight's good, which is crazy. Like, it's not even one of those fights where, like, you know, I love Lawler Condit, and it's on my top 5 list, I think, for top 5 welterweight wars. So in no way am I shitting on it. However, the contrarian argument, and not even a contrarian argument, I'm just saying I could see that side of the argument where you could be like, you know what? Outside of a moment in round 3, round 1, and of course legendary round 5, the middle was pretty much a low. Or you can't make that argument here. And not only that, it's so common to say, Brad, oh, this fight went everywhere. These guys show all their skills, or this fight has everything. Like, this fight literally has everything. Like, you even get Anthony Pettis offensive wrestling, which, by the way, watching Benson Henderson and Anthony Pettis and watching Jamie Varner versus Donald Cerrone 2 reminded me of that weird series where both these, like, lightweights all of a sudden learned how to wrestle at the end of their WEC career, fucking forgot all about it when they got into the UFC, and then had to remind themselves of it. Maybe in Pettis' case, not so much later in their career. But
Steve Gibbons fight.
yeah, there is. Yeah, yep.
He used it once.
Yeah, he used it once to get himself back on track, right? But no, and before I bounce it back to you, it does of course culminate with a minute left, the Showtime kick right off the cage. Like, this is how big it was. Like, I agree with Brad that it's almost an injustice because how much bigger it would be now, but this is how big it was then, almost 10 years ago. It feels like, right? I was still. I'm on the amateur team on a regular basis, training with pros and amateurs at Extreme Couture at this time. I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying that because after this fight, Brad,
everybody in the gym tried it.
Fuck, like, okay, in the beginning of practice, we got to run our laps right around the mats, right? And for the whole fucking year, at least one asshole, it's like minus 500, is gonna try. Hey, let's do the Showtime kick on this lap. And it was fucking like, okay, mark it off your list. Check it off your bingo list. Like, a whole fucking year, I was getting sick of the Showtime kick. Like, people would be trying to cute and doing it in sessions. It would just be getting their asses kicked. Like, it was great. Oh, it was great.
But yeah, this also, watching this fight again gave me a little flashback to something else. I think it happened on this card as well. But there's a little segment where Pettis is like backpacking Henderson, and then he drops down and gets his feet on the ground real quick and goes for a head kick. Well, he's still got the back control, and it just goes back to one of the things that happened earlier on this very card, where Donald Cerrone catches Chris Hordesky as he's like running away with the high kick and drops him. And one of the greatest MMA knockouts of all time, which is Eve Edwards and Josh Thompson with the like running away head kick. And I was just like, oh man, if he pulled that off in this fight as well, it would just, the head kick from that position just is something incredible to see.
Dude, Hordesky versus Cerrone was a good fight for sure. But wasn't it Ninja Kawani that hit the running away head kick on Hordesky?
Yeah.
No, it was still a great fight. It ended in triangle choke this one, though. Because no, the only way I know that is I just watched that one. But no, it's funny. You forget a lot about, to your point, though, you forget a lot about this card, right? Because it has that kick. But the things I wrote down in my notes specifically is Renan Barão makes his debut. We talked about Renan Barão coming later as far as a 30-some-odd bantamweight champion run. But you also get Yuri Alcantara knocking out Ricardo Lamas. And again, we're talking about, remember we talked about at the beginning of the show, Brad, about your 7 degrees of separation, why WEC is so useful? You have a bantamweight knocking out a guy, a featherweight at lightweight, right? But Lamas, a little bit before this, he beats, he unanimous decision, he doesn't knock him out, but he unanimous decisions James Krause at lightweight, who is now a welterweight, that recently beat a middleweight and competed at middleweight. So, like, within 3 fighters, you just went from bantamweight to UFC middleweight over a span of a decade. That's how much ground you cover with this WEC crop.
That was a brutal knockout.
It was a brutal knockout, but not as brutal as one of my favorite forgotten KOs, which was Ken Stone getting deadened by a slam by Eddie Wineland. One of the best slam KOs in MMA.
Yeah, that one.
One of the best.
Yeah, undoubtedly. And Wineland's he's real vicious about it too. He gets in there and gets his frames up and just tries to drive Stone through the mat. It's a nasty one. Yeah,
you're right. You see that exact moment where he installs his frames and goes down. And it's like a flyweight getting a knockout at that time, because that was like our flyweight division at the time, folks. Flyweight wasn't a prominent weight class. Yep. I don't even know how big the Lemoore shows in Tachi Palace were at this time. Where guys like,
I was watching them.
Yeah, right.
I know that doesn't count for anything.
Right. Like where guys like Michael McDonald came up, or Ian McCall was making his heyday as far as 125 goes. But yeah, there was a lot on that last WEC card. That's a great pick. And speaking of flyweights, and back to your number 1 pick, I mean, this is before the flyweight era of fights, but it's got about as many back takes as a Jussier Formiga fight, folks. Like,
yeah, they can't hold it quite as well as Juicy, but not too many people can hold on to back control as well as that guy. So,
absolutely. All right, that rounds out our lists. I'm gonna pull up the listener lists here, but while I'm doing that, Brad, I gave my 2 top honorable mentions. I know you have a bunch, but like, what were 2 that were like so close to making your list that we didn't talk about yet?
Ooh, the ones that were that close. Yeah, I think this one has more of a personal touch for me, just because of like the time period and how difficult it was to see this fight. And that's Donald Cerrone and Rob McCullough at WEC 36.
Great one.
That fight was, I heard about it on message boards, and people that were there and saw the fight, or heard about the fight from somebody that was there and saw the fight, would talk about it. But this is before the days of Facebook prelims, and definitely in the WEC, you didn't get to see the prelims unless there was a bunch of finishes and they had a break in the broadcast. This fight ended up going to decision. But I think in the first round, these guys drop each other like 5 times.
Yes.
That first round was like round of the year for sure. And once I eventually saw this fight, it came out on the Best of WEC DVD for that year. I had to wait like that long to see it. It absolutely lived up to the hype. And that one just because of that hunt to find it and finally getting that payoff at the end. That one was one of my honorable mentions for sure.
Great fight.
And then,
Can I jump in on that fight real quick before you go to the next one as you narrow your second one down? I'm glad you mentioned that one too. That one has a special place in my heart because it's. I'm pretty sure I actually did watch it live, but if not, I watched it the very next day because the very next day, my striking coach Joey Varner, no relationship to Jamie Varner. He was one of the guys that may or may not have concussed Griffin before that Anderson Silva fight. He was one of the striking coaches at Extreme Couture. I think he only had like a 2 or 3-0 pro record, but he's a matchmaking. He's like worn every hat, and he was mainly a striker. A lot of styles. Came from California as well, so he was familiar with all those guys. Of course, he was more from NorCal, and McCullough, I believe, was like that OC SoCal scene. But he was tight with Rob, with Rob McCullough, and we essentially had like a Gracie breakdown of that fight after, and not just the day after, but going forward, because it was such a great example as far as kickboxing and guards in MMA. Because again, you don't have defense isn't really a big theme today. You could argue, depending on who you're asking, especially if you're asking someone from the boxing field. But especially back then, defense isn't a big thing. And the commentary's doing a pretty good job of pointing out like Cerrone's old habits where he's kind of like swinging. He still has his head bob and his weird rhythm, but his arms are down here when he's doing it. Whereas Razor Rob, he's doing both a shell and head movement. Now, of course, as Razor Rob gets rocked and tired, that head movement starts going away, and you see
the shell starts dropping down a little bit.
Yes, yeah. And we essentially were just doing hand and guard drills, so that I had this fight fucking drilled into my head. So nice. and it was just a great fight too, kind of like what you said. Like Rob McCullough is showing the blueprint. Like it looks like every Donald Cerrone fight he has, like Eddie Alvarez, or to even more recent, what was that guy, Alexander Hernandez, where I always say this, Cerrone's check knee, which wasn't as big, he only actually uses it a couple times in this fight, and he finds it's really successful. You could maybe say this is where he starts seeing the turning point.
Adopt it.
But my litmus test is, like, some people will say if a guy is outside of the top 5, Cerrone beats him. If he's inside of the top 5, he loses. And that's, if you look at the record, that's a pretty fair statement. My stereotypical Cerrone judgment is, if you were 5'9" or under, you're getting eat the fuck up by his striking arsenal, particularly his check knees. And we see that because even if you were of commensurate striking level, or arguably, especially at this time, a better striker is in Rob McCullough, right? And again, depending on what version of Rob McCullough you got, because Rob McCullough was kind of a hot and cold fighter. But even then, even if you were, let's just say, a little better than Cerrone, if you were underneath 5'9", you would have to take Cerrone out fucking quick. Otherwise, once he got your rhythm, he was going to eat you up. And even though he doesn't have his check knee, you see that kind of hold true at this fight. So that's why I like that you brought up the Hordesky fight and the Rob McCullough fight, because it shows like this archetype that held true throughout Cerrone's career for the most part.
So the other one I'm going to go with isn't because it's necessarily a great fight.
Okay.
I think this one is a great finish, but it's more about the fighter. And we've gone through an entire episode about WEC, and we've mentioned pretty much everybody. We've mentioned Faber, we've talked about Torres, we've talked about all of the big names, but we have not talked, not even once, about Jose Aldo.
I know, what a crime! What a crime!
So my other honorable mention, I didn't even have this written down as one of them before, is his fight. I want to say, I don't have it like right in front of me right now. I want to say it's WEC 38, where, you know, we're talking about knees. Rolando Perez, they're getting a nice little striking battle. Perez is actually hanging with him pretty well on the feet, but he reaches a little too far with a jab, and Aldo just lightning quick with a knee, brings it up, checks Perez's chin, finishes him with a couple quick shots on the ground. And I think this is the first time that Aldo goes out and goes crowd surfing after this win, too. Yes,
that's one of my favorite. I didn't go back to watch this one, but this was a moment that I wanted to go back and rewatch. It didn't make the top of my list because there was so much to rewatch, A, and B, yeah. I already knew it wasn't going to be so much of a fight as with Jose Aldo's WEC career. Yes. Jose Aldo's WEC career is filled with, like, if I had top 5 moments, we might see 2 Jose Aldo. You know what I'm saying? Like, standings for this. Yep. So in my defense, but you're right. It feels like blasphemy that we didn't talk about Jose Aldo up until this point, right?
Had to get him in there.
No, that's a great shout. Before we hog up the spotlight on the way out of here, let's go to the Twitter submissions here. Benny Abs at Benjamin Abrigo on Twitter. Beyond some of the obvious ones, I love Condit Mira. Great pick. Obviously, we covered that one. Dan at Best Fight Picks. Obviously, Jung versus Garcia, which we talked about. Great pick. But an underrated one-round fight. I love Cerrone versus Krause. Throw in Brian Bowles versus Miguel Torres, too.
Okay.
That was good. I like the James Krause fight. You know what was crazy? I couldn't find it. I could have swore it was this fight. But when I recently, it was probably against the Southpaw, because when I recently went back to watch all of Cerrone, not all of Cerrone's, but specific Cerrone fights for McGregor, I probably just went back to watch the Southpaw fights. But I was surprised because, we always talk about the iteration of the Brandon Gibson, and Cerrone started to get improvements when he went to welterweight, and his hands got better, and look what he did to Rick Story, and that level-changing combo. He hits that exact same combo back in the WEC days against somebody, and I swore it was James Krause. But it might be somebody else. Maybe it's in his early UFC fights. Hit me up at Dan Tom MMA if you can think of that one. But yeah, Krause versus Cerrone is a good fight, though.
Yes, yeah. Krause, he made a good account of himself and his WEC, because he was just brought in as a guy for Cerrone to beat, really, and he ended up making a good account of himself for sure.
Absolutely. Aaron Bronstetter, a friend of the show, at Aaron Bronstetter on Twitter. And while the Showtime kick is in the highlight that is always shown, Aldo's fight with Cub Swanson is almost equally highlight worthy.
Yeah, it's a real quick one. That's back to the more recent example, obviously, is Jorge Masvidal and Ben Askren, and that was a little more out than Aldo put Cub Swanson. But yes, the double knee, the fact that he cut him above and below the eye, and Swanson just. He was obviously hurt, but I think after that he was like, "Yeah, I don't want any part of this. That's good."
Dude, between that and then I think Swanson wasn't he the one that got like the facial fracture from like taking a knee from Gillard before Gillard was like kicked out of Jackson Wink or something. Like knees and Cub Swanson, like that middle, it really set back that middle part of his career before he really got back into like more consistently winning, I should say, in action fights. But while we're on that really quick, that is the third card that I keep teasing since he mentioned it. Aldo versus Cub Swanson happened on WEC 41. If you're asking me gun in my head, top three, because you got, let me just read top to bottom. Mike Brown versus Uriah Faber 2, which is an underrated fight. One of my favorites, underrated fight.
Broken hands fight?
Yep, where Faber breaks his hands. Aldo versus Swanson in the co-main event. Cerrone versus Krause on that same card that we just talked about. Josh Grisby gets on the scene versus Jens Pulver, another legal offshoot. If you want to follow that story, warning.
Yeah.
Manny Gambarian beats John. That's kind of not too memorable. So is the even though it's a finish, Rafael Rebello over Kyle Dietz. Anthony Pettis chokes out Mike Campbell. Antonio Banuelos, of course, that amazing split decision fight against Scott Jorgensen. I believe that was their first one or the second one.
That was the first one.
First one? Okay, first one.
Yeah.
Frank Gomez defeats Noah Thomas via arm triangle, and Seth Dukin flying triangle choke against Rolando Perez. So like this, as far as I think, there's only one decision in the whole card. I mean, top to bottom, that's a great WEC card there.
Yeah, and in terms of the Banuelos Jorgensen fight, I haven't rewatched that one recently, but I can almost guarantee you that's a great fight. So
they're both
one doesn't really count as a decision. Manny Gambarian's Manny Gambarian, so.
Nobody fucks with their minions. Nobody. That's what I remember from that tough five fucking that house fight, and Nate Diaz is taking off his shirt, going what? Like tough five was so weird, man, and a lot of WEC people. Gabe Rudiger, you'll see his name a lot in these early WEC fights, but a lot of tough five cats.
Early champ.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Mark Chanier at Mark the Shark BC. Aldo versus Faber was the most memorable WEC fight for me. Seeing Faber's corner run in between rounds and put him back in his corner after Aldo wrecked his legs. Yikes. That speaking of Aldo moments, that's one for me, man. I mean, that was between round 4 and 5. Master Tong running in there and meeting Faber halfway carrying, which is technically illegal from the point he carried him. You got to let the fighter make it to his corner. But yeah, great shout.
I mean, they weren't going to stop a Faber fight in Sacramento for that, though.
No, no way, Jose. I remember those T-shirts.
Yeah.
Another good mention from Dan from at Best Fight Pick says another good mention is Brian Bowles versus Damasio Page. They fought both in the WEC and UFC, and both fights ended at the exact same time by the exact same method.
Yep. Guillotine at 3:30 of the first round.
Great shout, and great to be ready with that, with a technical stat there, Brad. Yeah, that was crazy. That was crazy. That's insane, man. And Brian Bowles again,
Legal
offshoots. Go follow at your own risk. We're full of that bingo here. But I did love me some Brian Bowles ring entrance. Him versus Dominic Cruz almost made my list. One of my favorite Dominic Cruz fights. And it starts off because Brian Bowles is the champion. He comes in with Johnny Cash. There's a man coming around taking names, and he's like this. And at the time, right, he's just really soft spoken. Like, I'm from Georgia, I love God, and I love knocking people in the chin. Like, he just seemed like that dude. So you're like, all right, let's see where this goes.
Yep. Actually, talking about the entrances, you reminded me of a couple great WEC entrances, and one is Aldo Faber when Aldo comes into in Sacramento to run this town for the pay-per-view. And then the other one is a fight that you talked about already, Jorgensen Cruz 2, or sorry, not Jorgensen Cruz 2, Benavidez Cruz 2, where Joseph Benavidez comes out to James Brown's Payback.
Oh yeah, that's so good. Yep. He's always got good songs, Joseph Benavidez. I forget one song he came out to, but his reasoning was because it was on the Boogie Nights soundtrack, and it's not even like one of the more. And it's a great soundtrack and a memorable movie, but he probably choose one of the least memorable songs for Little Bill when Little Bill goes crazy at the New Year's party and kills his cheating wife, played by whatever that porn star's name was, and he shoots himself. Like, Joseph Benavidez is like, yeah, that scene made me want to come out to that song for this fight. I'm like, what? That's why I love you, Joseph Benavidez. Like, who gets inspired for that scene? Yeah. Like, oh, that's going to be a walkout of mine.
If Joseph Benavidez had a list for a Dan Tom top 5 show, it would just be full of 5 hipster picks. I can guarantee it.
Well, someone posed the idea, I forget who it was. I don't know if it was you or Aaron or somebody was just like, dude, you and Joseph Benavidez should do like a top 5 movie show. And I thought the same thing because it was one of the shows we had him on for Junkie Radio, and he's got really good rapport with my co-host. Shouts to Gorgeous George and Goes. But I don't have as good a rapport with Joseph Benavidez, so I was kind of getting to know him, right? And I'm like, I really dig this guy. I always was a fan of his fighting style, but like he threw like a Barton Fink reference. I'm like, dude, like some hipster ass '90s movie. Like Dan Tom's a fan for life. You're gonna reference that shit. But real quick on the walkouts that we already mentioned, I was setting it up with the old school martial arts in Canada, coming from that like old school kickboxing scene, and Mark Hominick pays a great respect by coming out to Final Countdown. I mean, that is so 80s, early 90s martial arts, right? Like that was all that spirit. That had no MMA attachment to it all. That was like a shout to the old school martial arts fans.
Yeah, those guys from London. Hominick, Hordeski, Stout, all part of the Tompkins team. I didn't really have a chance to interact with them a ton, but every time that I have, just in passing or in brief, those are 3 entertaining guys. I'll say that. Maybe a couple of them can get a little bro-y at times, but
I'm sure
they're good guys.
You know what? I'll take a Canadian bro over an American bro anytime. Granted, I grew up in the West Coast of the United States, the heart of the brodom, but
there you go. Yeah.
Last submission, official one by Aaron Bronstetter. Torres Mitsugaki, great pick, which we covered. Kind of, that's the one where really you want to hear the Frank Mir bias going on full effect. Like, he's not giving Mitsugaki any credit on that fight. And I love Mitsugaki again, kind of like, shout out to co-host who's on here a lot, Jordan Killian. Like, he had that wrestle boxer style, like you talked about, Brad, but I always quote Mitsugaki being one of the more heavier-handed bantamweights, even though he didn't have all the knockout finishes, is because he had heavy enough hands and such a boxing-emphasized style that you kind of felt it in the fights. Not in the sense of like Francis Ngannou hitting someone, not so obvious, but you felt it in the temperature of the fight because he hit hard enough for his opponent to respect him, and it made his opponent respect his level, and it just created a great chain reaction.
Yep. Yeah. And that's where, like, you saw that a little bit in that the Cage Force run and tournament that he had, and that's what really got him into the WEC, and that's where you really started to see the power take hold a little bit. I think he had a couple of knockouts in Shudo before he ever got to that point, but he was against a better quality of opponent, so, sort of getting to that highest level of Japanese fighter at that time, and you could see it change things. Like, if it didn't affect a guy in terms of getting knocked out or getting hurt immediately, it was like, oh, like I need to mind my P's and Q's against this guy, or else I'm going to be sleeping.
Yep, and last thing on that before I finish off Aaron's list is like, another thing that reinforces this WEC bias for newer fans that see the hashtag WEC never die and why people are so passionate. It's like, even these guys that weren't like the biggest names, like Torres or George Root, for example, like you can go to their later careers, toward their end of their careers in the UFC, and when these WEC guys get matched up with each other, you still get a really fun fucking fight.
Yeah, Mizugaki and Root, yeah.
Yep, over in Japan. But he says Cerrone Varner fights, we covered those. Great pick, Aaron. Garcia Jung, we cover that. And yeah, thank you for that. Those were the listener honorable mentions. We talked about Faber versus Pulver 1. That's more like one of my favorite promos. I love that promo, that don't blink. You know,
yeah.
You gonna do this like somebody that Jens Pulver? He's got the "My name is Mudbeard." He's like, you gonna do this like somebody just started or a veteran or whatever that thing is, and he's doing the tennis ball. Like it's so great that promo. Go look it up on YouTube, folks.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that ever gets into the full card or the edited version of the card that's on Fight Pass, but that was a big deal at the time, that fight. Obviously Pulver had his run UFC lightweight champion and then left the organization, came back, the Lausanne shocker.
Yes.
Nobody saw that coming at the time. And then people thought he was just sort of done at that point, but he comes over to WEC and chokes out Cub Swanson in 30 seconds or something like that.
Like a guillotine or something, right?
And then let's use the old man to put the young guy over, and everyone thought that they build it as a great former UFC light heavyweight or lightweight champion. Everyone thought that Faber was just going to absolutely run through him.
Yes.
And if you watch the fight back, Faber clearly wins the fight.
Right.
But it's one of those 50-45 fights that's like 50-45, but if Pulver landed a couple more punches in the right rounds, it could have been like 48-47.
Yeah, totally. And you're right. Even whether it's hindsight eyes or at the time, you can't argue that Pulver didn't overperform because, again, talking about the promo, I remember being almost worried, Brad. I'm like, this promo is so good. Because I'm a movie guy, and I would avoid trailers because they give away too much for one. And sometimes they can get you too hyped. And then you go in with a high expectation in the movie. It might not even be bad, but you don't give it its justice. So I was almost worried. I'm like, dude, this fight's going to have to be good the way they're billing it. And luckily for them, Pulver overperformed. And it was a really good fight. And you even get classic stuff. Like, one of the cool things is I got to rewatch these fights with somebody who is not very familiar with MMA, but they're in a kickboxing. So they have a passion and actual experience with combat sports. So it's kind of one of those rare platforms where you can find someone in the year of 2020 who knows about combat sports and is into it, but hasn't seen classic UFC fights. You know what I'm saying? So
awesome.
I'm playing it for this person, and it's kind of like you have your favorite restaurant, Brad, or folks listening, and hopefully you're wired like
this.
You're
just like, how do you think? What do you think?
Yeah, what do you think, right?
Like it?
And
yeah.
And it's probably annoying, sure, but it also probably means you're a good person and a non-selfish person because you enjoy seeing other people get enjoyment of things you enjoy, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? And so it's great. So she was popping for all the fights, and she put them in a bit of a different order, but she essentially had my top 5 at the end of it. But when I was watching this Faber Pulver fight, you forget that Faber does his classic, when someone's going for a single, not only is he balancing like BJ Penn, but he's doing the jump knee to the face. And she
Eve
does
Edwards, Edson Berto.
Yeah. and the person I'm watching was, holy crap, pause, rewind that, I gotta see that again. And it's just so great, right? Because for me, it's like, oh, I forgot about that little novelty move. But someone who didn't see that, you're like, oh yeah, that's right. This was Matrix shit for us for that time where we were at.
And that dude at that time, he was such an incredible athlete, so fast. And just willing to do whatever it took to get the fight, or just not even get the fight where he wanted to, but just to inflict damage on his opponent. And obviously that's what ended up getting him caught and losing his title in the end, is just, going for stuff that was a little too unorthodox. But that ride from, WEC 19, where he won the title, and I'd be kind of remiss if I didn't at least mention the name Cole Escobedo, because that's a dude that
pioneered that division, or the lighter divisions.
Exactly. Yeah, people usually talk about pioneers for the lighter divisions as guys out of Japan, but in terms of North America, he was one of the guys who was sort of holding it down and making sure that the division had a strong foundation. So Cole Escobedo, Uriah Faber beat the shit out of him to win the title. And then, great fights with Jeff Curran and Chance Farrar, and a bunch of really fun fights. But the run is something that, unfortunately, when people really got into the WEC, it was coming to the end. So they never really saw the dominant Faber as champion on top run that people that even just a year or two before would have really seen and appreciated. So another guy, we're talking about guys who don't get the credit they deserve, and Faber, for me, is at the top of that list as well.
Absolutely. And the speed and athleticism, and you talk about in a much different way, of course, but like Benson Henderson dancing with the devil on almost like Faber would dart in and out like a karate fighter. Not like a karate fighter, complete different style, but as far as in the sense that he was darting in and out from a basic sense, relying on his speed. And he almost had this Sonic the Hedgehog thing where whether he was going in and out, whether it was successful, he almost had this after where you'd stop and go he knew he was faster. He's like, you saw that. Yeah, you saw how fast I was. Come at me, bitch. I'm going to change level or hit you with the right hand. Yep. What am I going to do? I'm going to dart. And like you said, it caught up with him in the Mike Brown fight, but Faber really captured that imagination because WEC was not something known in casual audiences, but Faber was one of, I don't know about your experience, Brad, but for me, I had a boss, this guy who I referenced on another show. He reminded me of the main character of Tiger King, this roofer guy I work for, and he was crazy and he's like crazy list. But one of the only MMA fighters he knew of for whatever reason was Uriah Faber. He's like, oh, how's that Faber, man? How's he doing? And I remember when Mike Brown lost, he couldn't believe it. He's like, what? Faber lost? And even though he was the most casual of casuals, and at this time I'm riding high, I'm considering myself a hardcore, but I was like, I get it. I get that. Yep. That's the same reaction as a hardcore I had too. I was like, holy shit. And that's why that fight, and obviously the subsequent rematch with its own inner narratives and layers, was much better than maybe on paper it reads.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And, you were just talking about Faber and his quickness. Just something that I pulled when I was watching Faber Pulver recently. It's funny because he's always got the hands down, sort of loose, jumpy style, like you were talking about. Mm-hmm. But the way that he really started to put that together into using that right hand in different ways from the same setup was pretty incredible. And in that Pulver fight, you see a great example of it, where from the same spot, he's throwing his overhand right, which is obviously that's his number one punch, but he's also using it to set up the exact same start for an right uppercut and a straight right. And he was landing on Pulver at will in that first round, using all three of those. And it was really sort of entertaining to watch and see him start to evolve his striking. Because before that, he was overhand right, scramble, going to get your back or get a guillotine on you.
Yes,
and
exactly.
He was just able to do it. But then you really started to see the evolution, and it's just kind of a shame that his title run and run at the top, well, his run at the top didn't really end for a decade after that.
Yeah.
That dude held on forever, but it was really fun to see that evolution in his game.
Absolutely. Well, we got roughly 5 or so minutes left. I got about under 2 handfuls left of honorable mentions. I'm not sure how many of you got, so let me just give at least a couple that almost made the list. I said the official honorable mention is probably going to be Nate Diaz versus Hermes Franca at WC 24. I didn't watch this fight live, but Tough 5 was one of the tough seasons I watched, obviously being a BJ Penn fan. And through there, I became a Nate Diaz fan, right? Because before I was just like, oh, the Diaz brothers are cocky, because all I knew was Nick Diaz fighting Sean Shirk, right? I didn't become the full-fledged Nick Diaz fan It wasn't until not even Strikeforce, Elite XC, where I start really getting on the Nick Diaz bandwagon. Right, obviously that Pride fight he had with Gomi at 33 was great. But yeah, I'm like, I become this Nate Diaz fan, so I want to go back and watch his older fights. And I knew, again, speaking of Sean Shirk, I knew who Hermes Franco was from following the lightweight title. Hermes Franco, folks, one of the first, Brazilian jiu-jitsu guys who could bang and hit heavy on the feet, as well as one of the first Brazilian jiu-jitsu guys who went and migrated up to the States as well. So he got a lot of being in Florida, especially a lot of cross-training opportunities, and was one of those first wave of Brazilians migrating to America and just trying to supplant himself in North American scenes. Of course, another fun in air quotes legal offshoot that guy got into to play legal offshoot bingo for the WEC.
Yeah.
But, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that's a guy that, because of when he came up, I don't think that he really got the opportunities and really the shine that he should have in MMA as a whole. Because he was a lightweight in the wasteland that was the UFC sort of 40s territory.
Oh yeah,
where they had some great lightweights, like Eve Edwards mentioned earlier, Josh Thompson, and Hermes Franca. They had those three guys had great fights.
You had to get through Hermes Franca to get to that title, man. Back then.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was really early in his MMA career. And then obviously, a couple losses and went away, came back to the UFC, and the Shirk fight wasn't his greatest performance by any mean, but that Nate Diaz fight was on his run up to the title, and yeah, that's a great call. And old school.
The rest of these I can pretty much mention the fight, and there's really nothing else to expand upon. So I'll just say this one that almost made my list was Brian Stan versus Steve Cantwell 2. And again, WEC 35, a great card there.
Yep.
Brian Stan versus Steve, because again, Brian Stan, it was your typical knockout artist who hasn't been to the first round, but they had a great story with Stan. You could tell they were trying to pump him up, and rightfully so. He's a great guy, and he had a decent career. It's not like he was going to be a world champion again, but you can't blame the WEC for gambling on him, but they were pumping up Stan super hard. It was a questionable stoppage, right? The first fight with Steve Cantwell. And Steve Cantwell comes in and survives the storm and is just picking him apart with kicks and good post-fight interviews. Both guys are super humble and about as classy as can be. And that fight almost made my list as well.
Yeah, I actually said this when we were rewatching WEC 35 for the MMA Analysis. But I know they had different military careers, but Brian Stan and Tim Kennedy, you couldn't have two more opposite personalities for dudes that sort of came up with the same push to be like, oh, he's a great patriot, he loves his country, he served us, and now he's a fighter.
Yeah.
But just two totally different guys.
It totally is funny. I did my Surviving the Apocalypse article, and I had Brian Stan number 1, and I didn't have Tim Kennedy on there, so everybody gave me shit. Because oh, why not Tim Kennedy? And the PC answer, which is true, is, I'm Hipster Dan. And picking a guy who's goes around teaching courses for Surviving the Apocalypse kind of felt like cheating. But then there was another part of it that kind of has to do with personalities. And I saw one person in the comments defending me who didn't even know me, but he got it right. And he goes, I don't know, man. Tim Kennedy kind of seems like a douche. I don't know if I want to be stuck. And I'm not trying to come at Tim Kennedy, but there is a bit of a difference as to what Brad alluded to. Brad, I feel like I've been hogging the ball, though. Do you have any honorable mentions you want to say before we get out of here?
I'm going to throw it back to a couple really old ones just because I feel like the early WEC stuff doesn't get enough shine. So
yes,
we talked about a couple of these guys, not specifically, but in the tough one sense. And Chris Lieben and Mike Swick actually fought for, I believe at the time it was was it the middleweight or WEC light heavyweight champion? feel like it had to be middleweight because Swick was never that big.
Yeah, I think so.
But yeah, this was back at WEC 9, and Lieben and Swick have a great fight. Chris Lieben, even later in his career and early in his career, he used to get caught and dropped all the time.
Oh, yeah.
And he's another one of those guys that he always had that recovery. So it just made his fights fun. And obviously that made it all the more special when Anderson was able to finally put the nail in his coffin and put him away. But, he gets hurt a little bit here and survives the storm against Mike Swick and ends up getting a pretty nasty KO win at the end of it. And just before my last one is sort of a crazy early MMA regional story, just in terms of the stuff that went on at that point. And it's Chris Lieben's WEC debut. So this is a fight. I don't even remember what the guy's name was. I don't care. I could look it up, but whatever. He's not an important character except in the context that he exists in this story, where Chris Lieben early in this fight, like maybe a minute in, lands a low blow and breaks this guy's cup. And he's hurting. It's not quite Pride style where they get all the like Japanese officials in, surround him, and they start like digging their hands in his pants to like pull out his cup and put a new one in. But they manage to, like, it looks like the fight's going to get stopped because this dude's down for like 5 minutes. But they get him out of the cage and they get a new cup in him. But during this time, as they're taking him out of the cage, all of the fans that are, I want to say arena, but it's out in the like Tachi Palace fairgrounds where they used to hold those fights outdoors. They all start chanting, "Let them fight, let them fight." And then they actually bring the dude back in. They start up the fight, and Lieben gets rocked by this like, guy who's probably as tubby as me, 5'5" jobber. And then the dude jumps on top of him, and Chris Lieben lands the Akiyama armbar on him to finish him off.
Yes.
It's just a wild fight. Akiyama was a triangle, wasn't it?
Yes.
But still, he lands a submission from his back and finishes off this fight. And it's just like a crazy, you would only see this in poorly regulated regional MMA in the early aughts.
Yep. Oh, that's a great shout there. Great shout. My last one's not too many early ones. The earliest one, probably Eddie Wineland versus Antonio Benuelos, have a good fight at WEC 20. Donald Cerrone versus Ed Ratcliffe at WEC 45. I just wrote that one down because it's a fun fight. But like, if you don't know Donald Cerrone, you just watch this fight, you'll swear he's the dirtiest fighter ever. Because like, essentially, like, it's a headline. I forgot that like this fight headlined, and I know Ed 9mm Ratcliffe, who I'm like, man. I wonder if he got more successful to the UFC, if he would have changed his name. Like, what was his name? Who won the PFL? Lewis Taylor, who had like some kind of like gang name, but he changed it.
Lewis, like Two Guns or whatever it was.
Yeah, he changed it to Put the Guns Down. Because I was like 9mm. That's pretty violent. That's a pretty violent nickname. But I feel bad for the guy, right? Because not only does he get like thrashed, right, and kind of what he was brought in for, but he has to survive like all these fouls, like all these different low blows, cage grabs. Like, it is so many goddamn fouls. I just want to throw that one in there. Mackin Semser versus Cub Swanson at UFC 52. That's a fun fight worth revisiting. Mackin Semser had heavy hands that made a lot of his fights fun. And lastly, Shane Roller versus Anthony Pettis at WC 50, just for the fact of Mark Lehman screaming his lungs out, "Please, Shane, watch out the triangle, please." Like, you just hear him like cracking, voice cracking, crying, pleading to avoid the triangle. And what does Pettis catch his guy in? A triangle. It's great.
That was was that one with like 10 seconds left in the fight too?
Oh yeah, it's under 45 seconds for sure in the third round in a close fight.
Yeah. I'm just going to throw one more out there.
Please.
Just because I know that you're a big half guard guy. So it was a good example of using half guard for a little bit and really getting that deep half. And that's Chase Beebe and Hani Yahya from WEC 30.
Nice.
So Yahya in the first minute or so has a deep knee bar on BB. BB managed to survive it, and then for the rest of the fight, he's just BB's on this mission. He's like, you know what? I'm going to try and submit this guy, who's one of the greatest jiu-jitsu practitioners in MMA, and it just turns into a really sort of fun battle where Yahya is trying to work his half guard game, and BB's just finding different ways to shut it down, but not in the traditional, I'm going to shut your half guard down and just smash you. he's like using it to try and work his own submission. So it was a really fun sort of fight, even though Yaya in typical fashion gets super gassed.
Yeah, Chase Beebe was another name that was fun to see again. I didn't go back to rewatch that one per se. Everyone knows I'm a big Ronnie Yaya fan, so I'm gonna have to for those reasons. Man, this was a blast. We got to get out of here, Brad. We're short on time. I knew we were gonna run along on this one, so that's totally okay. So I was stoked to have you. I was stoked to tackle this topic, and thanks to the listeners, by the way, who chimed in on their topics. You want to chime in on future topics, whether you want to suggest a topic to me at Dan Tom MMA, or submit your list to the show. Follow the show, the podcast, at the PYN Podcast on all social platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I won't spam your feed. Of course, this show is hosted by MixedMartialAnalyst.com, where you can find banners to support the show for free if you're a shopper of Amazon on it, or if you just want to go and subscribe to us on YouTube, iTunes. Leave us the favorable reviews on iTunes, Apple Podcasts. That helps. We're going to be coming to Stitcher and a bunch of other platforms. Now that my stupid plugs are out of the way, Brad, thank you again for joining me, and the floor is yours to plug whatever you want, shout whatever you want. Just try to keep the racial slurs to a minimum.
All right, I'll see what I can do. But I don't really have a lot to plug. As you said at the start, I co-host / hosted the MMA Analysis. I'm starting to get back into it a little bit more now that we're revisiting all these old fights. So give those guys a listen, me / those guys. And then the old site that I used to work for was MMA Oddsbreaker, Nick Kalikas, who you've had on the show previously. Great work in terms of betting odds for not just UFC, but MMA everywhere. And other than that, you should probably read and watch and listen to all of Dan's stuff, because he actually knows what he's talking about, where I just bullshit and drink beer.
No, I appreciate you guys. You guys have been one of the OG podcasts out there within hardcore circles. So definitely provided me with entertainment from a fan perspective, and that says a lot, because especially these days, my MMA podcast just keeps going down and down as far as what I listen to. So. Yeah. Take that for what it's worth. I appreciate you guys. Appreciate you coming on. Appreciate the listeners and those who support this show. We'll be back next week for some live chats, more top 5 shows coming your way. So be safe out there. Wash your hands, and always protect your neck.